Tonight we talk about the people who actually fight the wars. Not the space marines. Not the towering, genetically enhanced demigods in their ceramite armor, with their bolt weapons and their superhuman reflexes and their centuries of combat experience. Not the primarchs, not the custodes, not the sisters of battle, or the assassins, or the inquisitors, or any of the Imperium's elite, specialist, headline-grabbing warrior orders. Tonight, we talk about the Guard, the Imperial Guard, the Astra Militarum, the hammer of the Emperor, the largest fighting force in the history of the galaxy, the institution that has spent 10,000 years throwing ordinary human beings into wars against enemies that ordinary human beings were never designed to survive. And that has, through sheer numbers, sheer stubbornness, and a logistical apparatus so vast that it defies comprehension, managed to hold the line. Because the line must be held. And the Space Marines cannot hold it alone. There are approximately 1,000 Space Marine chapters in the Imperium. Each chapter contains approximately 1,000 warriors. That is 1 million Space Marines, give or take. Defending a galaxy that contains over 1 million inhabited worlds. The math is simple and the math is damning. There are not enough Space Marines. There will never be enough Space Marines. The superhuman warriors of the Adeptus Astartes are a scalpel, a precision instrument designed for decisive strikes. 4 critical interventions for the moments when the battle hangs in the balance and a single squad of genetically enhanced killing machines can tip the scales. But wars are not won by scalpels. Wars are won by hammers. And the hammer is the Guard. The Imperial Guard numbers in the trillions. Not millions. Not billions. Trillions, the exact figure is unknown. Because the Administratum's record-keeping, vast and meticulous as it is, cannot track the constant flux of recruitment, deployment, casualty and replacement that characterizes the largest military organization in human history. Worlds raise regiments. Regiments deploy. Regiments fight. Regiments are destroyed, their surviving members absorbed into other units. Their names removed from the rolls, their history filed in archives that no one will ever read. New regiments are raised to replace them. The cycle continues. This is the Guard. This is the Astra Militarum. This is the institution that takes human beings, ordinary men and women who were born on worlds that range from the civilized to the lethal, and turns them into soldiers, and sends them to fight enemies that are faster, stronger, more heavily armored, and more psychologically terrifying than anything the human body was designed to confront. And they fight. They die in numbers that the civilian populations of their homeworlds cannot imagine, in wars that the Administratum's public reports do not describe. Against enemies whose names the ecclesiarchy has forbidden the common people from knowing. They fight with weapons that are adequate rather than excellent, in armor that is thin rather than thick, with training that is sufficient rather than comprehensive. They fight because they have been told to fight, because the alternative is execution for desertion. Because the commissar standing behind the front line has a bolt pistol and the authorization to use it on anyone who turns away from the enemy. And sometimes, despite all of this, they fight because they believe. Because the Emperor protects, because the Imperium, brutal and grinding and dehumanizing as it is still the only thing standing between humanity and the darkness is worse. Because the Guard is the thin line of flak armour and lasguns that separates 1 million worlds from the things that want to consume them, and the Guard knows this, and the Guard holds. The Space Marines receive the glory. The histories record their names. The ecclesiarchy builds cathedrals to their victories. When a world is saved, the people remember the Space Marines who came like angels of death and turned the tide. And the people forget the Guard regiments who held the line for months or years before the angels arrived, who bled and died in numbers that the Space Marines could not match, because the Space Marines did not need to match them, because the Space Marines were designed to win battles, and the Guard was designed to survive them. There is a gulf between the Space Marine and the Guardsman that no amount of shared battlefield experience can bridge. The Space Marine is posthuman, a being that has transcended the limitations of the human body through genetic engineering and surgical modification and decades of conditioning. The Guardsman is human, fully, completely, irreducibly human. The Guardsman feels fear. The Guardsman feels pain. The Guardsman feels the cold, wet terror of standing in a trench with a lasgun and watching the horizon fill with things that the lasgun cannot kill. And the Guardsman processes that terror through a human nervous system that was evolved for surviving on the African savanna, and that has no adaptation for surviving in the 41st millennium. The Guardsman fights anyway. This is the part that the histories do not adequately capture. The Space Marine fights because the Space Marine was built to fight. Because their conditioning and their physiology and their entire existence is oriented toward combat in the way that a blade is oriented toward cutting. The Space Marine's courage is superhuman courage, a product of engineering rather than character, a feature of their making rather than a choice of the individual. The Guardsman's courage is human courage, real courage, the kind that exists not in the absence of fear but in the presence of it, in the conscious, deliberate decision to stand and fight when every instinct, every nerve, every screaming fiber of a terrified human body is begging for permission to run. The Guardsman chooses to fight. The Space Marine is built to fight. And the choice, the human choice, the fragile, terrified, magnificent choice to hold the line when holding the line means dying, is the most extraordinary act that the Warhammer 40,000 universe produces. Close your eyes if you like. This one is about the bravest people in the galaxy. The life of a Guardsman begins with conscription. On some worlds, the conscription is gentle, wrapped in ceremony and tradition, presented as an honor rather than a sentence. The young man or woman stands before their community, receives the blessing of the local priest, puts on the uniform, picks up the lasgun, and walks away from everything they have ever known with the cheers of their neighbors ringing in their ears, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that the cheers are a farewell. On other worlds, the conscription is brutal. The press gangs come at night. They come to the hab blocks where the poor live, to the labor camps where the indentured work, to the underhives where the unwanted exist in conditions that the administratum does not officially acknowledge. They take the young, the strong, the expendable, and they leave behind the old, the weak, the useful, the people whose labor the planetary governor needs more than the Departmentum Unitorum needs their bodies. The families that the conscripts leave behind are a footnote in the Guard's institutional history, a detail that the Departmentum Unitorum does not track, and that the administratum does not record. The mother who watches her child march away with the conscript column, the father who hands his son a small token, a coin, a pendant, a family heirloom that has been passed from generation to generation, and that now passes into the possession of a soldier who may not survive long enough to pass it to anyone else. The spouse who stands in the doorway of the HAB unit and watches the transport depart and wonders, in the quiet that follows, whether they will ever hear the conscript's voice again. They usually do not. The Imperium's communication systems do not prioritize personal messages from frontline soldiers, and the letters that some guardsmen write, the carefully worded, commissariat-censored messages that travel through the Imperium's postal system for months before arriving at their destination, if they arrive at all, are often the last communication that the family receives. The family receives the letter, they read the letter, they put the letter in the place where they keep important things, and then they wait for the next letter, which does not come, and the waiting becomes a kind of mourning, a gradual, unconfirmed grief that may last for years before the family accepts what they have known since the first letter did not arrive on time. The Departamento Munitorum does not send notification of death. The paperwork that would be required to notify the families of every killed guardsman would overwhelm the administratum's capacity, and the strategic value of the notification is, in the Munitorum's assessment, 0. The family learns of their soldier's death through absence, through the accumulation of unanswered letters and unfulfilled promises, through the slow corrosive erosion of hope that is, for the families of guardsmen, the home front's equivalent of the front line's daily casualty count. The conscripts do not get to say goodbye. The press gangs operate on schedules that do not accommodate personal sentiment, and the transports that carry the conscripts to the mustering grounds depart on time, regardless of whether the new soldiers have had the chance to embrace their families, or settle their affairs, or take one last look at the world they will never see again. Some conscripts volunteer. This is rarer than the ecclesiarchy's propaganda suggests, but it happens. A young person on a hive world, trapped in a life of manufactorum labor and hab-block poverty, with no prospect of advancement and no hope of escape, sees the Guard as an opportunity. Not a good opportunity, not a desirable opportunity, but an opportunity nonetheless, a chance to leave the hab-block and see the galaxy, and do something, even if the something is dying on a world 10,000 light years from home. The volunteers are not more courageous than the conscripts. They are more desperate. The Guard does not attract the ambitious or the idealistic. It attracts the trapped, the hopeless, the people for whom military service, with all its risks and its brutality and its near-certain death, is still better than the alternative. The Guard is the elevator of last resort, and the elevator only goes one direction: out. On most Imperial worlds, military service is not voluntary. It is a tithe, a tax paid in human bodies rather than in currency or goods. Every world in the Imperium is required to contribute to the Imperial tithe, and the tithe takes many forms: manufactured goods, raw materials, food and soldiers. The Departamento Munitorum, the vast bureaucratic apparatus that manages the Imperium's military logistics, determines how many soldiers each world must provide. And the planetary governors who are responsible for meeting the tithe's demands ensure that the required numbers are met by whatever means necessary. On some worlds, military service is a tradition, a cultural value that families pass down through generations. On Cadia, before its fall, every citizen was a soldier. Children learned to field strip a lasgun before they learned to read. The entire society was organized around the defense of the Cadian Gate, the corridor of real space that separated the Eye of Terror from the rest of the galaxy. And the production of soldiers was not merely a duty but a defining characteristic of Cadian identity. On other worlds, conscription is exactly what the word implies. A forced draft, carried out by the planetary government's enforcement agencies, targeting the young, the poor, the expendable. The recruiters come to the hab blocks and the manufactorum dormitories and the agri-world settlement, and they take whoever meets the basic physical requirements, and the conscripts are given a uniform, a lasgun, and a one-way ticket to whatever war zone the Departamento Militarum has assigned them to. They do not come back. This is understood. A guardsman who is deployed off-world does not return to their homeworld. The logistics of interstellar transport make it impractical to rotate troops back to their planets of origin, and the Departamento Militarum, which processes millions of soldiers through its systems every day, does not have the capacity to track individual soldiers' homeworlds or to arrange their return. A guardsman fights where they are sent, and when the fighting is over, if the guardsman is still alive, they are sent somewhere else. The process continues until the guardsman dies, which statistically does not take very long. The average life expectancy of an Imperial Guardsman in an active war zone is measured in hours, not days, not weeks. Hours, 15 hours according to some estimates. 15 hours from the moment the guardsman steps off the transport and into the combat zone to the moment a bolt round, a shuriken, a Gauss beam, a bioacid spray, or any of the galaxy's countless methods of killing a human being brings their service to an end. 15 hours. That is the number that the Departamento Militarum uses in its logistical calculations. 15 hours per soldier multiplied by the millions of soldiers deployed to each major campaign equals a burn rate that would horrify any civilization that had not spent 10,000 years normalizing the mass consumption of human life. The Departamento Militarum is the bureaucratic engine that keeps the Guard functioning. A vast, labyrinthine administrative apparatus that manages the logistics of the largest military force in human history. The Departamento Militarum processes billions of requisition orders daily. It tracks the movement of millions of regiments across a galaxy that is 40,000 light years from end to end. It manages supply chains that stretch across sectors and segmentums, delivering ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement equipment, and reinforcements to front lines that are measured not in kilometers, but in light years. The scale is beyond comprehension. The Departamento Militarum manages more soldiers than most civilizations have citizens. It processes more supplies than most planets produce. It generates more paperwork than most libraries contain. And it does all of this with a combination of ancient cogitator systems, armies of administrative clerks, and a bureaucratic culture that values thoroughness over speed, documentation over initiative, and procedural compliance over common sense. The results are mixed. On a good day, the Departamento Militarum delivers the right supplies to the right front at the right time, and regiments that were running low on ammunition receive fresh power packs, and regiments that were running low on food receive ration packs, and regiments that were running low on soldiers receive fresh conscripts. On a bad day, a regiment of desert fighters receives Arctic survival gear, and a regiment of Arctic specialists receives desert camouflage, and a regiment that desperately needs medical supplies receives a shipment of ceremonial, sashes that were ordered by a different regiment in a different sector. 3. Years ago, and that have been traveling through the Imperium's supply chain ever since, arriving exactly on schedule and completely uselessly. The bureaucratic errors are not anomalies. They are features of a system that is too large to manage with precision, too complex to simplify, and too vital to shut down for repairs. The Departamento Militarum is the machine that feeds the Guard, and the machine works in aggregate well enough to keep the Guard functioning. The individual errors, the misrouted supplies, the lost requisitions, the regiments that arrive at their deployment zone and discover that their reinforcements have been sent to a different planet, are the price of operating a logistics system at galactic scale. The soldiers who pay that price do not appreciate the excuse. The Guard does not horrify. The Guard calculates. The Guard replaces. The training that a Guardsman receives varies enormously depending on their world of origin. Acadian conscript has been training since childhood, drilled in the doctrines of combined arms warfare, educated in the tactical principles that have kept Cadia's soldiers alive against the forces of chaos for millennia. Acadian shock trooper is, by the standards of the Imperial Guard, a professional soldier, as well trained and well equipped as any non-Astartes warrior in the Imperium. A conscript from a backwater agri world has none of this. Their training consists of a few weeks of basic instruction: how to hold the lasgun, how to fire the lasgun, how to maintain the lasgun, how to follow orders, how to march, how to dig a foxhole, how to pray to the Emperor for protection that the Emperor may or may not provide. The officers who command the Guard are drawn from a variety of sources, and the quality varies accordingly. Some are graduates of planetary military academies, educated in tactics, strategy, logistics, and the art of leadership by institutions that have been producing officers for centuries. These officers arrive at their regiments with theoretical knowledge that is often excellent and practical experience that is typically non-existent, and the gap between what they learned in the classroom and what the battlefield actually looks like is the gap that kills many of them in their first engagement. Others are battlefield promotions, enlisted soldiers who demonstrated enough initiative, enough competence, enough sheer survival ability to attract the attention of their superiors. These officers have practical knowledge in abundance, but may lack the theoretical grounding that formal education provides, and their leadership style tends toward the pragmatic rather than the doctrinal, doing what works rather than what the manual says, which is sometimes more effective and sometimes catastrophically wrong. The worst officers, the ones who get the most soldiers killed, are the nobles. On many imperial worlds, military commissions are purchased rather than earned, and the sons and daughters of wealthy families buy their way into command positions that their education and ability do not qualify them for. These officers treat their regiments as extensions of their social status, making decisions based on their own vanity rather than on tactical necessity, leading their soldiers into situations that a trained officer would have recognized as lethal, and surviving the resulting catastrophe because their personal guard, purchased with the same wealth that bought their commission, gets them off the battlefield, while the soldiers they commanded die in the positions they ordered them to hold. Not all noble officers are incompetent. Some are genuinely talented, their wealth providing access to the best education and the best equipment and the best opportunities for development that the Imperium offers. but enough of them are bad to give the institution a reputation that the good ones struggle to overcome. The training is fast, because the Departamento Militarum needs bodies more than it needs trained soldiers. And the time spent training a conscript is time that the conscript is not spending on a battlefield, absorbing enemy fire that would otherwise be directed at more valuable assets. This calculation is brutal. It is also accurate. The Imperium cannot afford to spend years training each guardsman the way a Space Marine chapter spends decades training each initiate. The Imperium's recruiting worlds range from paradise to nightmare, and the soldiers they produce reflect the extremes. A hive world produces guardsmen by the millions, soldiers drawn from the overcrowded, polluted, violence-ridden lower levels of the hive cities. People whose lives before conscription were characterized by poverty, industrial labor, and the constant, grinding struggle to survive in an environment that was barely less hostile than the battlefields they would be sent to. Hive soldiers are tough, accustomed to close quarters living, familiar with the sound of gunfire and the sight of violence, and they adapt to the conditions of urban warfare with an ease that reflects their upbringing. An agri-world produces soldiers of a different kind, rural, physically robust, accustomed to hard labor and long hours but unfamiliar with the technology and the close-quarters social dynamics of military life. Agri-world soldiers learn quickly, because the alternative is dying. But the transition from the open fields and the quiet skies of an agricultural world to the enclosed, noisy, terrifying environment of a war zone is a shock that claims casualties before the enemy fires a shot. A feudal world, a planet whose technology has not advanced beyond pre-industrial levels, produces soldiers who may never have seen a lasgun before their conscription. These soldiers arrive at their regiment armed with the combat skills of their homeworld, skills that may include swordsmanship, mounted combat, or the kind of individual martial prowess that a feudal society values. And they must learn, rapidly, that the 41st millennium's battlefields do not favor individual martial prowess. They must learn to shoot. They must learn to take cover. They must learn to operate as part of a formation rather than as individual warriors. The learning curve is steep, and the soldiers who cannot climb it do not survive the first engagement. A death world produces the finest soldiers in the Guard, warriors who have been hardened by an environment that is more dangerous than most battlefields. These soldiers require minimal training, because their homeworld has already taught them everything they need to know: how to fight, how to survive, how to kill efficiently and without hesitation. The Guard values Death World soldiers above all others, and the regiments raised from Death Worlds are among the most decorated, the most feared, and the most effective formations in the Imperium's military. The Guard's strength is in its numbers, and maintaining those numbers requires a throughput rate that precludes extensive individual training. Better to send 1,000 poorly trained soldiers into battle and lose 500 than to spend a year training 100 soldiers to a high standard and lose them all when the first artillery barrage lands. The uplifting primer is the Guardsman's Handbook, a compact book of regulations, prayers, tactical advice, and morale-boosting propaganda that every Guardsman is required to carry and is theoretically required to have memorized. The primer is both useful and laughable, containing genuinely helpful information about field sanitation, basic first aid, and the proper maintenance of standard-issue equipment, alongside wildly inaccurate assessments of the enemy's capabilities that are designed to reassure rather than inform. The primer describes orcs as clumsy, poorly disciplined, and easily frightened. It describes chaos cultists as weak-willed degenerates who will flee at the first sign of resistance. It describes Tyranid bioforms as slow-moving and vulnerable to concentrated lasgun fire. These descriptions are, without exception, wrong. They are lies, deliberate misrepresentations designed to prevent the guardsmen from understanding the true nature of the enemies they will face. Because the Departmenta Munitorum has determined that a soldier who understands the true capabilities of a Tyranid Carnifex or a Chaos Space Marine or a Necron Destroyer is a soldier who is more likely to run than to fight. The lies work. Not because the guardsmen believe them, most veterans learn the truth within minutes of their first engagement, but because the lies provide a foundation of normalcy, a psychological anchor that allows the guardsman to process the unprocessable. The enemy is tough but beatable. The Emperor protects. The lasgun is a reliable weapon. These assertions, however inaccurate, give the guardsmen something to hold on to when the reality of the 41st millennium is trying to rip their sanity apart. The lasgun is the guardsman's most constant companion and the guard's most defining piece of equipment. It is not a good weapon. Not by the standards of the galaxy's other military forces. The lasgun fires a beam of focused light energy that is, by the standards of bolter rounds and Gauss beams and shuriken catapults, relatively weak. A single lasgun shot will kill an unarmored human. It will wound a lightly armored one. Against a space marine in power armor, against a Tyranid warrior in its chitin shell, against a Necron in its living metal body, a single lasgun shot is approximately as effective as throwing a rock. The soldiers of the Guard have a name for the lasgun: the flashlight. The nickname is dark humor at its finest, a self-deprecating acknowledgement that the weapon they carry is, by the standards of the galaxy's more dangerous inhabitants, approximately as threatening as a handheld torch. The nickname is unfair to the weapon, but not entirely inaccurate in its assessment of the lasgun's limitations when used against the enemies that the Guard most frequently faces. But the nickname also reflects a misunderstanding, one that the soldiers themselves correct through experience. The lasgun is not a weapon of individual power. It is a weapon of collective force. A single lasgun is a flashlight. A platoon of lasguns is a firestorm. A company of lasguns, firing in disciplined volleys, producing a sustained barrage of energy bolts that saturates the target area with concentrated photonic energy, is a weapon system that can suppress, pin, wound and kill targets that any individual shot would merely annoy. The key is volume. The Guard doctrine, hammered into every recruit during basic training, is simple. You do not shoot to kill. You shoot to contribute. Your individual shot is meaningless. Your individual shot joins the shots of the 39 other soldiers in your platoon, and the combined fire of your platoon joins the fire of the other platoons in your company, and the company's fire joins the fire of the other companies in your battalion. And the total effect of all these individually meaningless shots is a volume of fire that overwhelms defenses, suppresses movement, and produces casualties at rates that no individual weapon could achieve. This is the Guard's philosophy distilled to its purest form. The individual does not matter. The individual is meaningless. The individual is a single round in a magazine that contains trillions of rounds, and the magazine's value is not in any single round, but in the total number of rounds it can fire before it runs empty. The Guard does not fire single lasgun shots. The lasgun's strength is not in its individual firepower, but in its collective volume. A platoon of 40 guardsmen, firing their lasguns in disciplined volleys, produces a barrage of energy that can overwhelm light armor, suppress heavy infantry, and through sheer volume of fire, bring down targets that no individual lasgun shot could hope to damage. The lasgun is a weapon of mass employment, designed not for individual excellence, but for collective effect. And in the hands of the Guard, which has trillions of soldiers to employ, the collective effect is devastating. The lasgun is also reliable. It is simple to manufacture, simple to maintain, simple to operate. It draws power from rechargeable power packs that can be replenished by exposing them to heat or light, meaning that a guardsman who runs out of conventional resupply can, in theory, recharge their weapon's power pack by placing it in a fire. The weapon does not jam in the way that projectile weapons jam. It does not require the specialized ammunition that more exotic weapons demand. It works. In sand, in mud, in rain, in snow, in the corrosive atmosphere of a chemical world, in the vacuum of a space hulk. It is the most reliable weapon in the Imperium's arsenal, and it is issued to the most expendable soldiers in the Imperium's military, because reliability matters most in the hands of people who cannot afford for their weapon to fail. Flak armour is the guardsman's other constant companion, and it offers about as much protection as you would expect from a material that is one step above wearing nothing at all. Flak armour is composed of layered ablative material, panels of compressed fiber and ceramic that are designed to absorb the energy of shrapnel, low-velocity projectiles, and glancing energy weapon hits. Against these threats, flak armor is adequate. Against a bolter round, a chainsword, a power weapon, or any of the heavy caliber weapons that the galaxy's more dangerous inhabitants favor, flak armor is decorative. The guardsman knows this. The guardsman wears the armor anyway, because something is better than nothing, and because the armor carries the Imperial Aquila, and the Aquila means that the guardsman belongs to something larger than themselves, something that stretches across the galaxy and encompasses 1,000,000 worlds and 1,000,000,000,000 soldiers, and the belonging, however illusory the protection, matters. The guardsman's war is not the war of legends. It is not the war of the Space Marines, where individual heroes change the course of battles. It is not the war of the Primarchs, where demigods clash over the fate of civilizations. The guardsman's war is the war of mud and blood and cold rations and broken equipment, and the constant, grinding, unglamorous work of holding ground that no one will remember, and fighting battles that no one will celebrate. And yet it is the most important war in the galaxy, because without it, the legends do not happen. Without the Guard holding every other line, the Space Marines cannot concentrate their strength for the decisive blow. Without the Guard absorbing the enemy's numbers, the Primarch's battles would be fought against overwhelming odds. Without the Guard, the Imperium falls. Not dramatically, not heroically. It simply crumbles, one undefended line at a time, one overrun position at a time, one lost world at a time, until there is nothing left to defend and no one left to defend it. This is the Imperial Guard. Poorly armed by galactic standards, poorly armored by any standard, poorly trained, on average, by the standards of the enemies they face, deployed in numbers so vast that the individual soldier is statistically meaningless, a rounding error in the Departmenta Munitorum's casualty projections, a single drop in an ocean of expendable humanity. And yet the Guard holds. The Guard has held for 10,000 years. The Guard will hold for 10,000 more. Because the Guard is the Imperium. The Guard is humanity. The Guard is the answer that the human species has given to every force in the galaxy that has tried to extinguish it. The answer is, we have more people, and we are willing to spend them. But let us not rush past the spending. Let us pause for a moment and talk about what it is actually like to be one of the spent. A guardsman's day in an active war zone begins before dawn. The wake-up is signaled by the company vox, a burst of static followed by the watch officer's voice, and the guardsman rolls out of whatever passes for a bunk, which might be a regulation cot in a prefabricated barracks on a well-supplied front, or a hollow scraped into the side of a trench on a front where supply lines have been cut for weeks. The first action of the day is weapons maintenance. The lasgun is checked, cleaned if necessary, its power pack tested. The flak armour is inspected for damage, the ceramic panels examined for the hairline cracks that indicate structural failure. The fiber layers checked for the kind of degradation that comes from repeated exposure to chemical environments, biological agents, and the general wear and tear of a soldier's life in the field. The armour is often old. The armour is often repaired. The armour has often been worn by previous soldiers who did not survive their deployment. And the new wearer tries not to think about the person who wore it before, the person whose body heat has faded from the padding, the person whose sweat has stained the inner lining, the person who died wearing this armour and who was replaced by the guardsman who is now wearing it and who will in turn be replaced by the next, the straps tightened, the ceramic plates checked for cracks. This maintenance ritual is drummed into every guardsman during basic training, and it is performed with a devotion that borders on the religious. Because the lasgun is the guardsman's life, and a lasgun that misfires or a power pack that fails at the wrong moment is a guardsman who dies. Breakfast is a ration pack, a compressed block of nutritional material that provides the calories and the vitamins that the Departamento Munitorum has determined a human soldier requires for a day of combat operations. The taste is not a priority. The nutritional content is a priority. The ration pack is bland, dense, and monotonous. And the guardsmen who have been eating them for months or years have developed a relationship with their rations that is characterized by resigned acceptance rather than enjoyment. The briefing follows breakfast. The platoon commander, a lieutenant who might be a graduate of a planetary military academy or a battlefield-promoted sergeant who learnt tactics the hard way, reviews the day's objectives, the expected enemy activity, the disposition of friendly forces, and the contingency plans for when the expected enemy activity turns out to be wrong, which it usually does. The guardsman eats, checks their weapon, prays and prepares. The preparations are personal. Some guardsmen write, some stare at photographs, images of families and homes that they will never see again, faces that are becoming harder to remember with each passing deployment. Some check and recheck their equipment, running through the maintenance routines that training burned into their muscle memory, finding comfort in the repetition, in the predictable, in the one element of their existence that they can control. Some do nothing. They sit. They stare at the wall of the trench or the floor of the barracks or the ceiling of the chimera, and they let the minutes pass, because the minutes before a fight are the minutes when the mind is most dangerous, when the imagination runs ahead of reality and produces scenarios that are worse than anything the enemy will actually do. The experienced soldiers have learned to go blank, to reduce their consciousness to a narrow, focused point that admits nothing except the immediate sensory input, the weight of the lasgun, the feel of the flak armour, the sound of the vox, the smell of the air. Everything else is noise. Everything else is the mind trying to destroy itself with fear. The sergeant moves through the squad, checking equipment, checking faces, checking the psychological status of each soldier with the intuitive assessment that combat experience produces. The sergeant knows which soldiers will hold and which will break. The sergeant knows which soldiers need a word of encouragement and which need to be left alone. The sergeant knows, with the quiet confidence of someone who has done this 100 times, exactly how much pressure the squad can absorb before it fractures, and the sergeant's job is to keep the pressure below that threshold. The sergeant is the most important person in the Imperial Guard, not the general who plans the campaign, not the colonel who commands the regiment, not the commissar who enforces the discipline. The sergeant who stands in the trench with the soldiers, who fights beside them, who dies beside them, and who keeps them fighting when every rational impulse is telling them to stop. A good sergeant is worth a company of raw recruits. A good sergeant turns conscripts into soldiers, turns soldiers into veterans, turns veterans into the backbone of a regiment that can hold a line against anything the galaxy throws at it. A good sergeant saves more lives than the medicae and prevents more routes than the commissar, and the sergeant does it through the simple, ancient, irreplaceable mechanism of personal example. Then the fighting starts. Or the waiting starts, which is worse, because waiting means sitting in a trench or behind a wall or inside a chimera with nothing to do except think about the fighting that is coming. And thinking about the fighting is the guardsman's enemy, because the guardsman's imagination, fed by the memories of previous engagements and the fears of future ones, produces scenarios that are more terrifying than the reality usually turns out to be. Usually, the time between engagements is when the Guard's culture, such as it is, manifests. The soldiers play cards. They gamble, using ammunition, rations, and personal items as currency. They tell stories, usually lies, about their previous engagements, each story more improbable than the last. The exaggeration serving the dual purpose of entertainment and stress relief. They write letters home, letters that will travel through the Imperium's postal system for months or years before reaching their destination, if they reach it at all, and the letters are carefully censored by the commissariat to ensure that no sensitive information about the campaign or the enemy reaches the civilian population. They pray, individually, in groups, in formal services conducted by the regimental chaplain, and in informal moments of private communion with the Emperor that the guardsman performs whenever they need the psychological comfort that prayer provides. The faith varies from guardsman to guardsman, from the devout believer who genuinely feels the Emperor's presence in their heart to the pragmatic skeptic who prays because everyone else is praying, and because the alternative, facing the darkness without the comfort of faith, is harder than facing it with. They sleep, not well, not deeply. The guardsman's sleep is light, interrupted, haunted by the sounds and the images of combat that the sleeping brain processes and reprocesses in dreams that are vivid and disturbing and that the waking mind cannot suppress. The veterans develop a particular talent for falling asleep instantly and waking instantly. a survival adaptation that allows them to extract the maximum amount of rest from the brief windows between engagements. Medical care in the Guard is basic by the standards of the Imperium's more privileged institutions, and miraculous by the standards of most planets in the galaxy. The regimental medicae, the medical officers attached to each Guard formation, are trained to treat the injuries that combat produces, las burns, shrapnel wounds, crush injuries, chemical exposure, and the full spectrum of physical damage that the galaxy's weapons inflict on the human body. The medicae operates under conditions that would horrify a civilian hospital. The operating theatre is a tent or a room or a corner of a trench. The instruments are cleaned between patients if there is water. The anesthesia is a combination of chemical painkillers and, for the less fortunate, a leather strap to bite on. The medicae triages ruthlessly, categorizing the wounded into those who can be saved, those who cannot be saved, and those who can save themselves. The resources go to the first category. The second category receives the Emperor's Mercy, a euphemism for a lethal injection or, if the supplies are depleted, a bolt pistol round. The third category is told to patch themselves up and get back to the line. The soldiers who survive their wounds and return to combat carry the scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their service. The Guard does not have a comprehensive system for treating psychological trauma. The concept of combat stress, the recognition that prolonged exposure to the extreme conditions of the 41st millennium's battlefields produces lasting damage to the human mind, is not widely understood within the Guard's institutional culture. A soldier who is unable to function is a soldier who is weak, and weakness in the Guard's harsh calculus is treated not with therapy but with discipline. The result is a military force whose frontline soldiers carry a burden of accumulated psychological damage that would render a civilian population non-functional. The Guard works because the soldiers have no alternative. There is no formal discharge from the Guard. The Departmentum Unitorum does not process retirement paperwork, does not provide pensions, does not acknowledge the concept of a soldier who has served long enough to earn the right to stop serving. Service in the Guard is, in theory, permanent in practice. Some soldiers do eventually leave active service, either through crippling injuries that make them unfit for combat, or through the rare informal arrangements that sympathetic officers sometimes make for soldiers who have served with exceptional distinction. These former soldiers, the ones who survive long enough to stop fighting, face a particular kind of challenge. They have been in the Guard for years, sometimes decades. They have been trained to kill. They have been conditioned to follow orders. They have been immersed in a culture of violence and discipline and the constant proximity to death that has become normal to them. And now they are released into a civilian world that they do not recognize, that does not understand them, that has no place for the skills they have spent their adult lives developing. Some are settled on the worlds they helped to conquer, given land grants on planets that the Guard has claimed for the Imperium. These settlements are the Imperium's version of veteran support, a piece of ground, a modest allocation of supplies, and the freedom to build a new life on a world that was, until recently, hostile territory. The settlers bring their military discipline to the task of farming and building, and the colonies they establish are often the most orderly and the most resilient communities on the planet, because the settlers know how to dig in, how to fortify, how to defend, and how to endure. Others are not so fortunate. The soldiers who are discharged without a settlement, who find themselves on worlds where their military experience is irrelevant and their psychological scars are invisible, struggle to adapt. They are haunted by what they have seen, what they have done, what they have survived. The nightmares continue. The hypervigilance continues. The instinct to reach for a weapon that is no longer there continues. They are soldiers in a world that does not need soldiers, warriors in a society that values productivity over prowess. And the gap between what they are and what the world expects them to be is a gap that many of them cannot cross. There is no discharge from the guard except death. There is no therapy. There is no recovery. There is only the next engagement. And the engagement after that. And the engagement after that. And the guardsman functions because the guardsman must function. And the functioning continues until the body fails or the mind shatters or a bolt round from an orc slugger makes the question academic. Let us talk about the regiments. Because the Guard is not one army, it is a million armies, each one raised from a different world, each one shaped by the culture and the environment and the history of the planet that produced it. And the diversity of these regiments is the Guard's greatest strength and its most enduring legacy. The Cadian shock troops are the standard, the baseline, the regiment that every other regiment is measured against, the soldiers whose doctrines and equipment and organizational structure form the template that the Departamento Militarum uses when it has no other reference point. Cadians are professional soldiers in the truest sense of the word, raised on a fortress world that spent its entire existence staring into the eye of terror, and the discipline that this proximity to humanity's greatest enemy produced was the finest military tradition in the Imperium. The Cadians' reputation extended beyond their own regiments. Cadian military doctrine became the standard against which all other Guard doctrines were measured. Cadian drill sergeants were seconded to other regiments to improve their training. Cadian tactical manuals were distributed across the Imperium as reference texts. The phrase Cadian Standard became shorthand for the baseline level of competence that the Departamento Militarum expected from any Guard formation, and regiments that met the standard were considered adequate, while regiments that exceeded it were considered exceptional. The children of Cadia were born into the military, not metaphorically. Literally, Cadian children received their first lasgun at the age the children of other worlds received their first toys. They learned weapons handling, tactical doctrine, and the art of combined arms warfare alongside reading, writing, and the catechisms of the ecclesiarchy. By the time a Cadian reached the age of conscription, they were already a soldier, already trained, already tested by the proximity to the Eye of Terror that made Cadia's daily life a constant low-level exercise in military preparedness. The Eye of Terror was visible from Cadia's surface, a wound in the sky, a permanent, pulsing scar in the fabric of reality that glowed with the sickly light of the immaterium. Every Cadian grew up under that light. Every Cadian knew what the eye contained. Every Cadian understood, in a way that the citizens of other worlds could not, that the forces of chaos were not abstract, not distant, not theoretical. They were right there. They were always right there, and the only thing between them and the rest of the galaxy was the wall of steel and flesh that Cadia represented. The Cadians' famous violet eyes were a genetic marker of their proximity to the Eye of Terror, a subtle mutation produced by millennia of low-level warp exposure that changed the pigmentation of the iris without affecting the vision or the mind. The violet eyes were a badge of identity, a mark of the Cadian lineage that identified the bearer as a child of the fortress world even when they were fighting on the far side of the galaxy. Cadia fell. This is the wound that the Guard carries in the 41st millennium, the loss that defines the current era of Imperial military history. The 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon the Despoiler's final assault on the fortress world, succeeded where 12 previous crusades had failed. Cadia was destroyed, its crust cracked by the impact of a black stone fortress, its populations scattered across the galaxy as refugees and survivors. The fall of Cadia was the most devastating military defeat the Imperium had suffered since the Horus Heresy. Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade brought the full might of the Chaos forces to bear against the fortress world, and the defense of Cadia, led by Ursaka Creed and supported by Space Marine chapters, Mechanicus forces, and the Imperial Navy, was the most desperate and the most heroic last stand in Imperial military history. The Cadians fought. They fought with the discipline and the determination that had defined their culture for 10,000 years. They held every line. They contested every position. They made the forces of chaos pay for every meter of ground in blood and fire, and the relentless, grinding resistance that only the best trained soldiers in the galaxy could sustain. They were not enough. The forces arrayed against them were too numerous, too powerful, too deeply imbued with the warp's corruption for even the finest Guard regiments to overcome. Abaddon's forces included Chaos Space Marines from multiple legions, demonic entities of staggering power, and the Blackstone Fortress that the Despoiler used as the campaign's final weapon. The Blackstone Fortress was dropped onto Cadia's surface, its impact cracking the planet's crust, triggering catastrophic geological upheavals that shattered the fortress world from within. The planet broke apart. The defenders who could reach the evacuation transports escaped. The rest died with their world. The survivors scattered across the galaxy, carrying nothing but their weapons, their training, and the memory of the world that had defined their identity for 100 centuries, became refugees. Warriors without a home, soldiers without a fortress. The finest military tradition in the Imperium severed from the planet that had nurtured it. But Cadia's legacy did not die with the planet. The surviving Cadian regiments, the shock troops who were off-world when the planet fell, carried their traditions, their doctrines, and their identity with them into the wider galaxy. Cadian military doctrine continues to be taught. Cadian organizational structures continue to be replicated. The planet is gone. The standard endures. The fall of Cadia sent shockwaves through the Guard that are still being felt in the current era. Regiments that had been trained on Cadian doctrines, equipped with Cadian pattern weapons, led by officers educated in Cadian tactical methods, suddenly found themselves operating without the institutional center of gravity that had anchored the Guard's military culture for 10 millennia. The surviving Cadian regiments scattered across the galaxy, each one carrying a fragment of the fortress world's legacy. Some were absorbed into other sectors' forces. Some maintained their identity as independent Cadian formations, fighting under the Cadian banner on worlds that had never heard of their homeworld. Some were assigned to the Indomitus Crusade, Guilliman's massive military campaign to retake the Imperium's lost territories, and these regiments fought alongside the Primaris Space Marines and the other Crusade forces with a ferocity that reflected both their martial heritage and their grief. The Cadians who survived the fall carry a particular kind of burden. They are the last of their kind. The fortress world that trained them, that shaped their culture, that gave them their identity, no longer exists. Their children, if they survive long enough to have children, will be born on worlds that are not Cadia, will grow up under skies that do not contain the Eye of Terror's malignant glow, will never know the constant low-level readiness that defined Cadian life. The Cadian military tradition is being maintained through deliberate effort rather than through natural cultural transmission. And the effort, however dedicated, cannot fully replicate what an entire world's worth of collective experience produced over 10,000 years. Cadia stands. That is the Cadians' motto, and they mean it, not as a statement of geographical fact, but as a declaration of cultural identity. Cadia is not a place. Cadia is an idea. The conviction that discipline, training, and the willingness to stand your ground against the worst the galaxy can produce are sufficient to hold the line, and the line must be held. The Catachan jungle fighters are everything the Cadians are not. Where the Cadians are disciplined, the Catachans are improvised. Where the Cadians fight in formation, the Catachans fight in the shadows. Where the Cadians are the product of a culture that valued order and hierarchy, the Catachans are the product of a planet that is actively trying to kill them. Catachan is a death world. The jungles contain predators that can swallow a human whole, insects whose sting can kill a space marine, plants that are carnivorous, venomous, explosive, or all three simultaneously. A person who grows up on Catachan is, by the time they reach adulthood, one of the most dangerous human beings in the galaxy. Not because they have been trained by a military academy, because they have been trained by a planet that kills anyone who cannot keep up. Catachan regiments are recognizable by their appearance: bare arms, bandanas, muscles that would look at home on a recruitment poster, and an attitude that combines casual disregard for authority with absolute competence in the field. They fight in small, independent squads, using ambush tactics, using the guerrilla warfare techniques that their homeworld's jungles taught them. And they are devastatingly effective. Commissars assigned to Catachan regiments have a notably high mortality rate. The Catachans do not respond well to rigid-by-the-book discipline, and several commissars who attempted to execute Catachan soldiers for breaches of regulation have been found dead under circumstances that the official reports describe as accidental, but that everyone understands were anything but. The death corps of Krieg are the Guard's darkest mirror. Krieg was once a loyal imperial world that rebelled against the Emperor's rule. The rebellion was put down by Krieg's own loyalist population, who fought a civil war of such ferocity that both sides resorted to nuclear weapons. The loyalists won, but the price of victory was the destruction of Krieg's biosphere. The planet was reduced to a radioactive wasteland, and the surviving population was determined, with a fervor that bordered on mania, to atone. The Death Corps is Krieg's atonement. Every soldier considers their life a debt owed to the Emperor, a payment for the sin of their ancestors' rebellion. Death Corps soldiers do not fear death. They welcome it. They seek it. They consider their own death in battle the fulfillment of a sacred obligation, and they fight with a corresponding disregard for their own survival that makes them uniquely effective in the most brutal, attritional forms of warfare. The Death Corps does not retreat. The Death Corps does not surrender. The Death Corps advances, always into the teeth of the enemy's fire, accepting casualties that would break any other regiment, and continuing to advance, because the advance is the payment, and the payment must be made. Their aesthetic is deliberately anonymous. Death Corps soldiers wear gas masks. Always, the mask erases the individual, removes the face, the identity, the personal characteristics that distinguish one human being from another. They are assigned numbers rather than names. Their quarters are Spartan. Their interactions with other regiments are formal and characterized by a joylessness that other soldiers find deeply unsettling. They do not celebrate victories. They do not mourn their dead. The Death Corps' approach to warfare is influenced by the trench warfare of ancient Terran history, particularly the conflicts of the Age of Progress that the lore hints at in fragmentary references. Their tactics, their equipment, their aesthetic, all echo the industrialized warfare of an era that preceded the Age of Strife, and the echoes are deliberate. A conscious choice by a culture that values the grim, grinding, unglamorous style of warfare that achieves its objectives through attrition rather than brilliance. A Death Corps regiment does not produce heroes. The concept of individual heroism is alien to Krieg's military culture, because individual heroism implies that the individual matters. And the Death Corps does not believe that the individual matters. The regiment matters. The mission matters. The Emperor's judgment matters. The soldier is a component, a replaceable part in a machine whose function is atonement, and a component does not seek glory. A component performs its function until it fails, and then it is replaced by another component, and the machine continues. This philosophy produces a military force that is uniquely effective in the attritional engagements that other regiments find demoralizing. The Death Corps advances into fire that would break Akkadian regiments' morale. The Death Corps holds positions that a Catachan regiment would abandon. The Death Corps sustains casualties that a Mordian regiment would consider unacceptable. Because the Death Corps does not measure success by casualties sustained, but by ground gained. And ground gained at any cost is ground gained. And ground gained is atonement. And atonement is the only purpose that Krieg acknowledges. Other regiments find the Death Corps disturbing. The joylessness, the anonymity, the willing, almost eager acceptance of death produces an atmosphere in combined operations that the soldiers of other worlds find oppressive. The Death Corps soldiers do not join in the campfire conversations. They do not participate in the card games. They do not share the gallows humor that other regiments use to cope with the stress of combat. They sit in their trenches, in their gas masks, in their silence, and they wait for the next advance. And the waiting is not anxious or fearful or impatient. It is simply waiting, the way a machine waits for its next task. They simply fight, and die, and are replaced. The siege of Vrax is the Death Corps' defining moment. Vrax was an imperial world that fell to chaos, and the Death Corps was assigned to retake it. The siege lasted 17 years. 17 years of trench warfare, of attritional grinding, of the slow, methodical advance that the Death Corps considers the proper way to wage war. The casualties were measured in the millions, and the Death Corps absorbed them without comment, because casualties are the price. The Tallarn Desert Raiders fight in the sand. Tallarn was once a verdant world transformed into desert by a virus bombing during the Horus Heresy. The Tallarn people adapted, becoming masters of the arid wasteland, developing tactics optimized for desert warfare. Talon regiments are mobile, fast, specialized in hit-and-run tactics, striking from unexpected directions, disappearing before the response arrives, and striking again from a different angle. The Valhallan Ice Warriors come from the opposite extreme. Valhalla is a frozen world of ice and temperatures that kill the unprotected in minutes. Valhallan soldiers are accustomed to cold, to hardship, to grinding attritional warfare. They are stubborn, resilient, and possessed of a patience that enemies mistake for passivity, until the Valhallans counterattack with surprising ferocity. The Mordian Iron Guard are the Guard's most disciplined regiment. Soldiers whose parade ground precision has earned them a reputation for formality that other regiments find either admirable or absurd. Mordians fight in perfect formation, their ranks aligned with mathematical precision, their volleys timed to the second. The Mordian Iron Guard does not break. It stands, fires, reloads, and fires again, with a mechanical precision that makes them less an army and more a weapon system. The Attilan Rough Riders deserve mention for their sheer anachronism. The Attilan people are horsemen, riders from a world whose culture revolves around the mounted warrior in a galaxy that has long since moved past the horse as a viable military platform. The Rough Riders ride into battle on horseback, carrying hunting lances that have been modified to deliver an explosive charge on impact, and the sight of a squadron of Rough Riders charging across a battlefield, their horses at full gallop, their lances lowered, is one of the most visually striking and most tactically questionable images in the Guard's entire repertoire. The charge works. Not because the horses are faster than tanks or because the lances are more powerful than anti-armor weapons. Because the charge is unexpected. Because the enemy, accustomed to dealing with infantry and vehicles and artillery, does not expect to be assaulted by cavalry. And the moment of confusion that the charge produces, the half-second of cognitive dissonance that the enemy experiences when their tactical assessment is disrupted by the appearance of a mounted warrior in a technological war, is the half-second that the Rough Riders exploit. The charge is also spectacularly dangerous. A horse and rider on a 41st millennium battlefield is a large, unarmored, easily targeted combination that every weapon system in the enemy's arsenal can destroy with minimal effort. The Rough Riders who charge know that most of them will not survive the charge. They charge anyway, because the charge is their heritage, their identity, their contribution to the Imperium's wars. And the Attilan people would rather die in the saddle than live on foot. The Vostroyan firstborn have a tradition that defines their identity. Every firstborn son of every family is given to the Guard. This is penance for their failure to contribute troops during the Horus Heresy. The Vostroyan firstborn are well equipped by Guard standards, their regiments outfitted with heirloom weapons and ornate armor that reflects their planet's industrial heritage. The Armageddon Steel Legion are mechanized infantry, soldiers who fight from armored transports that their homeworld's vast industrial output produces in enormous quantities. Armageddon has been the site of 3 major wars, and the Steel Legion's doctrine reflects the lessons learned: speed, firepower, and the ability to concentrate force with the rapidity that mechanized warfare allows. The Imperial Guard recruits from both sexes, and both serve in every role from frontline infantry to tank crew to officer corps. The law is clear on this point. The Guard does not discriminate based on gender, because the Departamento Munitorum does not care about gender. The Departamento Munitorum cares about numbers, and restricting recruitment to one sex would halve the available pool of conscripts, which would be a logistical luxury that the Imperium cannot afford. In practice, the integration of male and female soldiers varies by regiment, reflecting the cultural norms of the worlds from which the regiments are drawn. Some worlds, like Cadia, have a military culture that is genuinely egalitarian, where men and women serve together without distinction, and where the only metric that matters is the soldier's ability to fight. Other worlds have cultural traditions that segregate the sexes, producing regiments that are predominantly male or predominantly female, and the Departamento Munitorum accommodates these traditions as long as the regiments meet their combat effectiveness requirements. The experiences of women in the Guard are, by and large, identical to the experiences of men. They are conscripted, trained, deployed, and killed at approximately the same rates, facing the same enemies, using the same weapons, dying the same deaths. The galaxy's enemies do not discriminate by gender. The Tyranids do not care whether the biomass they consume is male or female. The orcs do not distinguish between men and women when they charge the trench line. The Chaos Gods are equal opportunity corruptors. Each regiment is a world. Each regiment is a culture. Each regiment brings its own approach to the common problem of killing the enemies of the Emperor before the enemies kill you. And the diversity is what makes the Guard effective on a galactic scale. The Guard fights in every style of warfare that the galaxy demands. Siege warfare, the slow, grinding, attritional approach that the Death Corps of Krieg has perfected, is one extreme. The siege is a war of patience, of engineering, of the methodical reduction of an enemy position through bombardment, tunneling, and the progressive advance of trench lines. A siege can last for years. A siege consumes resources and lives at a rate that would bankrupt a lesser military force. The Guard wages sieges because the Guard can afford to, because the Guard's resources are the Imperium's population. And the Imperium's population is, for all practical purposes, infinite mobile warfare. The rapid, fluid approach that the Talon and the Steel Legion favor is the other extreme. Mobile warfare is about speed, about maneuver, about hitting the enemy where they are weak and withdrawing before the enemy can concentrate their strength. Mobile warfare requires vehicles, coordination, and the kind of tactical flexibility that the Guard's rank and file soldiers are not always equipped to provide. And the regiments that specialize in mobile operations are among the most effective and the most respected in the Guard's order of battle. Trench warfare, the brutal, close-range, attritional fighting that characterizes the Guard's most prolonged engagements, is the style that the Guard falls into when neither siege nor maneuver is possible. Trench warfare is the Guard at its most elemental. Soldiers in holes, firing at enemies in holes, advancing across the ground between the holes at the cost of lives measured in the thousands, gaining territory measured in meters. The trenches of Vrax, of Armageddon, of 100 other worlds whose names the wider Imperium has forgotten, are the Guard's natural habitat, the environment in which the Guard's defining qualities, endurance, stubbornness, and the willingness to absorb casualties are most fully expressed. Drop warfare, the aerial insertion of troops by Valkyrie or by Grav Shoot, is the Guard's most dramatic operational style and the one with the highest casualty rates per engagement. The Elysian Drop Troops, the Guard's premier airborne regiment, specialize in rapid insertion behind enemy lines, and their operations combine the speed of mobile warfare with the vulnerability of soldiers who are, for the duration of the drop, completely exposed to enemy fire and completely unable to take cover. An Elysian drop operation begins with the Valkyries, the transports screaming in at low altitude, their engines howling, their door gunners laying down suppressive fire on the landing zone. The troops jump, falling through the air with their grav chutes slowing their descent just enough to prevent fatal impact, and they hit the ground running. Because a soldier who hits the ground and stops moving is a soldier who dies. Because the enemy has been watching the Valkyries come in, and the enemy has been targeting the landing zone since the first aircraft appeared on their auspex. The first 30 seconds after a drop are the most dangerous. The soldiers are scattered, disoriented, landing in an area that they have not reconnoitered, surrounded by terrain they do not know, facing an enemy whose positions they can only guess at. The officers gather their squads. The soldiers find their bearings. The fighting begins, and the casualties, even in a successful drop, are significant, because the window of vulnerability between the landing and the consolidation is the window during which the enemy can kill the most soldiers with the least effort. Or sometimes the Departamento Munitorum's bureaucracy deploys desert specialists to a jungle and jungle fighters to a frozen wasteland, and the soldiers adapt or die. Because adaptation is what humans do and dying is what guardsmen do, and the Guard does both in enormous quantities. The enemies that the Guard faces are nightmares given flesh. Consider what it means to be a guardsman facing an orc charge. The orcs are coming. You can hear them before you see them, the thundering footsteps of a horde that numbers in the thousands, the guttural, bellowing war cry that carries across the battlefield like a physical force. Then you see them, green-skinned, towering, each one twice the size of a human, each one carrying a weapon that is crude and ugly and perfectly capable of tearing through your flak armour like it is not there. They are running at you. They are faster than you expected. They are closer than you expected, and there are more of them than you expected. You have a lasgun. You have flak armour. You have the 15 hours of life expectancy that the Departamento Munitorum has calculated for your deployment. You have the commissar behind you who will shoot you if you run. You have the soldiers beside you who are just as frightened as you are. You fire. You fire again. The lasgun's beam hits the charging orc, and the orc does not stop. The orc does not slow down. The orc barely notices, because a lasgun shot that would kill a human does not kill an orc. Orc physiology is too resilient, too redundant, too fundamentally different from human biology for a single lasgun shot to produce the kind of immediate, fight-stopping damage that the uplifting primer promised you it would. You keep firing. Everyone keeps firing. The combined fire of your platoon begins to have an effect. Orcs stumbling, falling. The volume of fire doing what individual shots cannot. But the orcs are still coming. They are 20 meters away. 15, 10, and then they are on you. And the Chinaxes and the choppers and the massive green-skinned fists are swinging, and the fighting is close and brutal and one-sided in a way that the uplifting primer did not describe. This is what the Guard faces, every day. On every front, against every enemy. And the Guardsman is expected to stand against it. To hold the position, to fire the lasgun into the green wall of charging orc flesh, and to keep firing until the power pack runs dry, or the orcs reach the trench, or the order to withdraw comes through the vox, if the vox is still working, if the officer who gives the order is still alive, if the withdrawal route has not already been cut off by the orcs who have flanked the position while the guardsman was focused on. The horde in front of them. Consider now the guardsman facing Tyranids. The swarm is approaching. The soldier can see it on the horizon, a moving mass of biological material that stretches from one edge of their field of vision to the other. the sound reaches them first, a chittering, scraping, clicking cacophony that is unlike anything the human ear has evolved to process. A sound that triggers a deep, primal response in the limbic system, the part of the brain that evolved to recognize predators and that is now recognizing, correctly, that the approaching mass is predatory and that the guardsman is prey. The officer gives the order to fire. The platoon fires. The lasguns send their beams into the swarm, and the beams hit, and the organisms that they hit fall, and the swarm does not slow down. The organisms behind the fallen ones climb over the bodies and keep coming. The swarm is a fluid, adapting in real time to the casualties, flowing around the dead the way water flows around stones, and the rate of advance does not change, because the swarm's momentum is not dependent on any individual organism's survival. The guardsman fires faster. The power pack drains. The guardsman swaps the pack for a fresh one, the practiced motion of thousands of repetitions, and fires again. The swarm is closer now. The individual organisms are visible, hormagaunts, all claws and speed, bounding across the open ground with a fluid alien grace that makes the guardsman's stomach drop. Behind the hormagaunts, the larger organisms, warriors, carnifexes, things that the uplifting primer assured the guardsman were vulnerable to lasgun fire and that are most definitely not. The first hormagaunts reach the trench. The fighting becomes close range, hand to claw, bayonet to mandible. The guardsman is fighting an organism that is faster than them, stronger than them, and equipped with biological weapons that the guardsman's flak armour cannot stop. The guardsman fights anyway. The bayonet goes in, finds something that might be a vital organ, and the hormagaunt screams and thrashes and dies. And another one is right behind it, and another one behind that. This is what the guard fights. Not once. Not in a single climactic battle. Day after day. Week after week. The swarm keeps coming. The guard keeps dying. The reserves keep arriving. Fresh soldiers to replace the fallen. And the fresh soldiers fire their lasguns into the swarm and learn, in the space of 15 hours, everything that the veterans know and that the uplifting primer did not tell them. The first engagement is the hardest. The veterans will tell you this. The soldiers who have survived long enough to have opinions about such things. The gnarled, scarred, dead-eyed guardsmen who have been fighting since before the new recruits were born. The first engagement is the one that breaks you or makes you, and the breaking is more common than the making, because the first engagement is where the uplifting primer's lies collide with reality, and the collision produces casualties, both physical and psychological, that the training did not prepare the soldier for. The veterans who watch the new recruits arrive at the front experience a mixture of pity and pragmatism that is the guard's most characteristic emotional state. They look at the new faces, the clean uniforms, the unscratched armor, the lasguns that have never been fired in anger, and they see themselves, years or decades ago, standing in the same position, wearing the same expression of mingled terror and determination, carrying the same uplifting primer that has not yet been disproved by experience. The veterans do not befriend the new soldiers immediately. This is not cruelty. This is self-preservation. A veteran who becomes attached to a new recruit who dies in their first engagement, which is statistically likely, absorbs a psychological wound that the veteran cannot afford, because the veteran is already carrying the weight of every previous loss, and the capacity for grief is finite. The veteran waits. They watch the new recruits fight their first battle. They note which ones hold and which ones break. And then, after the first engagement, when the survivors have been separated from the casualties and the recruits have become soldiers, the veterans open up, cautiously, incrementally, with the careful, measured emotional investment of people who have learned, through repeated experience, that attachment in wartime is a luxury that the 41st millennium taxes heavily. A guardsman who survives their first engagement is changed. The fear does not go away, the fear never goes away. But the fear becomes manageable, predictable, a familiar companion rather than an overwhelming master. The veteran learns to function within the fear, to use it as fuel rather than fighting it as an obstacle, to let the adrenaline sharpen rather than scatter their focus. The veteran learns the rhythms of combat, the initial terror, the settling into routine, the moments of acute danger when the routine breaks, the exhaustion that follows when the fighting stops. The veteran also learns what the uplifting primer will not teach them: how to kill effectively with the tools they have been given. The lasgun is not powerful enough to kill an orc with a single shot, but a lasgun aimed at the orc's head, at the narrow gap between the crude helmet and the thick neck, can penetrate the skull and damage the brain. And even an orc cannot function without a brain. The veteran learns the weak points, the vulnerabilities, the places where the enemy's armor is thin and the lasgun's beam can do real damage. The veteran learns to fight smart, because the guard cannot afford to fight strong. This knowledge is passed from veteran to recruit in the trenches, in the barracks, in the brief moments between engagements when the experienced soldiers share what they know with the new arrivals who are about to face their first battle. It is informal education, an oral tradition of survival techniques that the Departamento Militarum does not officially endorse, and that the uplifting primer does not contain, and it saves more lives than any official training program. The veterans do not share this knowledge out of altruism. They share it because a recruit who survives their first engagement becomes a soldier who can help hold the line, and the line needs holding, and every soldier who lives through the first 15 hours is a soldier who might live through 15 more, and 15 more after that, and the cumulative effect of each survived engagement is a force that is slightly more effective, slightly more resilient, slightly harder to break. The Tyranids are worse. An orc charge is terrifying but comprehensible, a mass of hostile organisms running toward you with weapons. A Tyranid assault is something else entirely. The swarm comes from every direction simultaneously, a living wave of chitinous bodies that pours over terrain, through buildings, under obstacles, above cover. Gaunts skitter across the ground on multiple legs. Gargoyles drop from the sky. Warriors advance through the swarm, larger, more dangerous, directing the smaller organisms with the hive mind's cold intelligence. The guardsman fires into the swarm, and the swarm does not thin. Each organism killed is replaced by another, and another, and another. The swarm is not a formation. It is a biological process, a tide of living matter that flows around obstacles and fills every gap and overwhelms every defense through sheer, relentless biological pressure. The guardsman fires until the power pack runs out, and then picks up another weapon, and fires until that runs out, and then uses their bayonet, and then uses their fists, and then the swarm reaches them, and the last thing they see is a wall of chitinous bodies, and razor-sharp mandibles, and the cold, alien hunger of a species that does not hate them, does not fear them, does not even notice them. The Necrons present a horror that is different from the biological threats. A guardsman facing Necrons is facing an enemy that does not bleed, does not tire, does not feel pain, and does not stay dead. The first time a guardsman watches a Necron warrior that they have just killed stand back up, its metal body reassembling itself with a quiet, mechanical hum, and resume its advance with the same implacable, unhurried pace as before, something breaks inside the guardsman's understanding of how combat works. You can kill an orc and it stays dead. You can kill a Tyranid and it stays dead. You can kill a chaos cultist and it stays dead. You shoot a Necron and it falls and then it rises, and then you shoot it again and it falls and rises again. And the rising is so matter-of-fact, so utterly devoid of drama or effort, that the guardsman begins to wonder whether the shooting has any point at all. The Gorse weapons that the Necrons carry add another dimension to the horror. The Gorse Flayer strips matter atom by atom, peeling the target apart layer by layer, and the guardsman watches their comrades dissolve, their armour, their uniform, their flesh, stripped away in a process that is clinical and thorough and absolutely terrifying. The death is not instant. The death is progressive. And the guardsman, watching from behind their barricade, understands that the same death is waiting for them when the Necrons reach their position. Morale against Necrons collapses faster than against almost any other enemy. Not because the Necrons are the most dangerous, because the Necrons are the most demoralizing. The enemy that cannot be permanently killed. The enemy that strips you apart atom by atom. The enemy that advances with the slow, implacable certainty of a geological process is an enemy that attacks the guardsman's most fundamental assumption, that fighting back matters, that the lasguns' shots are accomplishing something, that the defense is not merely postponing the inevitable. The commissars earn their pay against Necrons. The Chaos Space Marines are the worst. Not because they are the most numerous or the most physically powerful, though they are both. Because they are the enemy that the Guard is least equipped to fight. Psychologically, a Chaos Space Marine is what happens when one of the Emperor's own warriors turns against him. They are superhuman. They are armored. They are armed with weapons that outclass the Guard's standard equipment in every measurable dimension. And they are driven by forces, the Chaos Gods, the warp, the accumulated madness of 10,000 years of corruption that the average guardsman cannot comprehend, and that the uplifting primer cannot adequately describe. Facing a Chaos Space Marine in combat is facing the Imperium's own strength turned against it. It is facing a mirror that reflects everything the Guard fears. That the Emperor's protection has limits. That the Imperium's greatest warriors can fall. That the darkness is not merely external but internal. Waiting inside the Imperium's own institutions for the moment when faith falters and the corruption seeps in. The Guard's encounters with chaos are the source of the institution's deepest anxieties, the wounds that the commissariat works hardest to suppress. A Guard regiment that has fought against chaos forces is a regiment that has been exposed to truths that the Imperium does not want its soldiers to know. They have seen the daemons. They have seen the warp. They have seen the evidence that the universe is not what the ecclesiarchy says it is, that the Emperor's power has limits, that the forces of corruption are not merely external enemies but manifestations of a dimension of reality that is as fundamental as the physical universe and that is utterly irredeemably hostile to human existence. The Imperium's response to this exposure varies. Regiments that have fought minor chaos incursions, engagements involving cultists and renegades rather than daemons and chaos marines, are typically debriefed, subjected to psychological screening by the commissariat, and returned to service with their memories of the engagement officially classified, and their discussions of it officially prohibited. Regiments that have fought major chaos incursions, engagements involving demonic manifestations, warp phenomena and the kind of reality warping horrors that leave psychological scars on everyone who witnesses them, are treated differently. These regiments may be quarantined, they may be mind-wiped, their memories of the engagement removed by the Inquisition's psychers. In the most extreme cases, they may be sterilized, their entire population eliminated to prevent the possibility that the knowledge they carry might spread to the wider population. The soldiers who serve in these regiments have no say in which response the Imperium chooses. They do not know. When they are loaded onto the transports after the engagement, whether they are being moved to their next deployment or to their execution. The uncertainty is itself a form of torment. The knowledge that the Imperium they serve is capable of killing them not because they have failed, but because they have succeeded, because they have fought and won and survived, and the surviving has made them dangerous. The Guard does not discuss this. The Guard cannot discuss this, because the commissars enforce a strict policy of information control regarding the nature of chaos, and a guardsman who displays too much knowledge of the ruinous powers is a guardsman who attracts the attention of the Inquisition, and the Inquisition's attention is not something that a guardsman survives. The commissar is the Guard's enforcer, its disciplinarian, its executioner. The commissar is an officer of the Officio Prefectus, trained at the Schola Progenium, educated in the doctrines of imperial faith and military discipline, and authorized by the Imperium's highest authorities to maintain morale and combat effectiveness through whatever means necessary. Whatever means necessary includes summary execution. A commissar who judges that a soldier's behavior threatens the unit's effectiveness, whether through cowardice, insubordination, heresy, or any other infraction that the commissar deems sufficient, can draw their bolt pistol and shoot the offending soldier on the spot. No trial, no appeal, no review. The bolt pistol fires, the soldier dies, and the rest of the unit understands clearly and immediately the cost of failure. This sounds brutish. It is brutish. It is also, within the context of the 41st millennium's military operations, effective. A unit that has watched its commissar execute a soldier for running away is a unit that is less likely to run away, because the commissar has demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, that the punishment for retreating from the enemy is immediate and fatal. The history of the commissariat is a study in the tension between brutality and effectiveness. The commissars who are remembered, who are honored, who are held up as examples for the next generation of Schola Progenium graduates, are not the ones who shot the most soldiers. They are the ones who shot the fewest, because they did not need to. They are the ones whose presence was so commanding, whose courage was so evident, whose leadership was so effective that the soldiers they commanded fought not because they feared the bolt pistol, but because they believed in the officer who carried it. The commissar is trained at the Schola Progenium, the Imperium School for Orphans of Imperial Servants, a rigorous institution that takes children who have lost their parents to the Emperor's service and raises them as the Imperium's future leaders. The Schola produces commissars, stormtroopers, sisters of battle and inquisitorial acolytes, and the training is demanding. The discipline is absolute, and the indoctrination is thorough. A commissar who graduates from the Schola Progenium is a believer, not merely a functionary. A believer. They believe in the Emperor. They believe in the Imperium. They believe in the Guard's mission and the Guard's methods and the Guard's necessity, with a conviction that has been forged in the Schola's furnace and tempered by years of education that leaves no room for doubt or questioning. This faith is the commissar's greatest asset and their greatest liability. The faith gives them courage. It gives them conviction. It gives them the moral certainty that allows them to draw the bolt pistol and fire it into the face of a soldier who has faltered, without hesitation, without regret, without the kind of moral uncertainty that would paralyze a person who had not been trained to view execution as a sacrament. But the faith also blinds them. A commissar who has been trained to see cowardice as heresy and retreat as treason is a commissar who may not recognize the difference between a soldier who is running away and a soldier who is executing a tactical withdrawal. A commissar who has been indoctrinated to enforce the Emperor's will without question is a commissar who may enforce it in situations where enforcement produces more harm than the infraction it punishes. The good commissars, the ones who lead rather than merely threaten, understand that execution is a tool of last resort rather than a first response. A good commissar leads from the front, fighting alongside the soldiers, sharing their dangers, earning their respect through competence and courage rather than through fear. A good commissar knows when a soldier's fear is a sign of weakness, and when it is a sign of sanity, and a good commissar knows the difference between a soldier who needs a bullet and a soldier who needs a word. Commissar Yarrick is the Guard's most famous officer, and his legend demonstrates what a commissar can be when competence and charisma align. Sebastian Yarrick defended Armageddon against the largest orc invasion in the planet's history, the Second War for Armageddon, and his leadership during that campaign became the stuff of Imperial legend. Yarrick fought the orcs with a tactical acumen that earned the respect of even Ghazghkull Thraka, the war boss who led the invasion, and Ghazghkull's respect for Yarrick became a defining element of both characters' lore. The orc war boss considered Yarrick a worthy enemy, the only human who had proven himself in Ghazghkull's estimation as a true fighter, and the rivalry between the two became the narrative core of Armageddon's wars. Yarrick's legend is built on moments. The moment when, during the Second War for Armageddon, the old commissar single-handedly rallied a broken defensive line by walking calmly into the no-man's land between the Imperial position and the Orc advance, standing in the open, visible to both sides, and daring the Orcs to shoot him. The Orcs, who respect courage above all else, paused. The guardsmen, who had been on the verge of retreat, paused as well. And in that pause, that moment of mutual incredulity, Yarrick turned to his soldiers and said what needed to be said. And the line reformed, and the position held. Yarrick understood something about the Guard that many officers, including many commissars, did not. That the soldier's will to fight is a finite resource that must be managed rather than enforced. A commissar who rules through fear produces soldiers who fight because they are afraid of the commissar. And soldiers who fight because they are afraid are soldiers whose effectiveness collapses the moment the commissar is killed, or the fear of the enemy exceeds the fear of the bolt pistol. A commissar who leads through respect produces soldiers who fight because they believe in the officer who leads them. And soldiers who believe are soldiers whose effectiveness endures even when the officer is not watching, even when the fear is overwhelming, even when the situation is hopeless. Yarrick lost an arm fighting the orcs and replaced it with a power claw taken from a defeated war boss. He had a commissarial stormbolter mounted on his arm. He was old, grizzled, scarred, missing an eye that he replaced with a bionic implant that, according to orc legend, could kill with a look. The orcs believed this. Yarrick, who understood the psychological dimension of warfare better than most Imperial officers, did nothing to dispel the myth, because a myth that made the enemy afraid was a weapon as powerful as any bolt pistol. Osaka Creed was Cadia's last great commander, the Lord Castellan who led the defense of the fortress world during the 13th Black Crusade. Creed was a tactical genius, a commander whose ability to position forces and anticipate enemy movements became legendary even among the Space Marine chapters who fought alongside him. His signature ability, the capacity to deploy large formations, even super-heavy tanks, in positions that the enemy had not expected, became the stuff of in-universe humor and out-of-universe meme culture. Creed vanished during the fall of Cadia, taken by the Necron Lord Trazyn the Infinite, who collected the Lord Castellan as a specimen for his Museum of Galactic History. Whether Creed is alive, dead, or preserved in some form of stasis within Trazyn's collection is unknown. The Cadians mourn him. The Imperium honors his memory, and the tactical genius of Cadia's last defender endures in the doctrines and the training manuals that carry his name. The tanks of the Imperial Guard are the Guard's most significant force multiplier, the weapons systems that elevate the Guard from a light infantry force to a combined arms military capable of engaging the galaxy's heaviest threats. The Leman Russ battle tank is the Guard's workhorse, a heavily armored, heavily armed fighting vehicle that has served the Imperium for 10,000 years without significant modification. The Leman Russ is not sophisticated. It is not fast. It is not elegant. It is a box of armor with a large gun on top, and it does what a box of armor with a large gun on top does. It absorbs fire. It delivers fire. And it provides the infantry with a mobile fortress that they can advance behind. The Leman Russ has been described as the anvil to the Space Marine's hammer, and the description is accurate in ways that go beyond the purely tactical. The Leman Russ endures. It takes punishment that would destroy more sophisticated vehicles. It operates in conditions that would render more delicate machines non-functional. It fights in mud, in sand, in ice, in the corrosive atmosphere of a chemical world, in the thin air of a high-altitude battlefield. And it keeps fighting, not because it is technologically superior to the enemy's vehicles, but because it is technologically adequate and mechanically robust and produced in such enormous numbers that the loss of any individual tank is strategically meaningless. This is the Guard's philosophy applied to machinery. Not excellence, but sufficiency. Not the best, but the most. Not the weapon that wins battles through individual superiority, but the weapon that wins wars through collective persistence. The Leman Russ does not need to be the best tank in the galaxy. It needs to be the most numerous. And it is. The crews who operate the Leman Russ develop a relationship with their vehicle that is part professional, part personal, and part superstitious. The tank receives a name. The tank receives rituals, small acts of maintenance that are performed in a precise order, not because the order matters mechanically, but because the crew believes. With the irrational conviction of soldiers who live in proximity to death, that the order matters to the machine's spirit, and the machine's spirit must be appeased. The Mechanicus would disapprove of this personification. The ecclesiarchy would redirect it toward the emperor. The crews do not care. The tank is their home, their fortress, their weapon, and their coffin, and they will treat it however they choose. Because the bond between a crew and their tank is the bond that keeps the crew alive, and a living crew is a crew that fights effectively, and an effective crew is a crew that the Departamento Munitorum does not need to replace. The Leman Russ is reliable. It is manufacturable, it is maintainable by crews with basic technical training. It operates in every environment, from desert to jungle to tundra to urban ruins. It has been produced in numbers so vast that the total count is unknown, and it has been destroyed in numbers nearly as vast, and the production lines that replace the losses have been running continuously for millennia. The Leman Russ comes in variants that reflect the diversity of the Guard's tactical needs. The standard Leman Russ battle tank carries a battle cannon that fires high explosive shells at ranges that allow it to engage enemy armor before the enemy can close to effective range. The Leman Russ Demolisher replaces the battle cannon with a Demolisher cannon, a short-range weapon that fires massive shells designed for urban warfare, demolishing walls, bunkers, and fortified positions with a single shot. The Leman Russ Vanquisher carries a specialized anti-armor weapon capable of penetrating the heaviest enemy vehicles. The Leman Russ Punisher replaces the main gun with a multi-barreled Gatling weapon that fires a sustained barrage of heavy bolter rounds, chewing through infantry formations with a volume of fire that makes the lasguns' collective effect look gentle. A Leman Russ crew consists of a commander, a driver, a gunner, and a loader, 4 soldiers sealed inside an armored box, communicating through the intercom, fighting a battle that they can only see through the tank's narrow vision slits and the commander's periscope. The crew's world is the tank's interior, the heat of the engine, the smell of cordite, the constant vibration of the chassis, the deafening roar of the main gun firing, the metallic ringing of enemy fire striking the hull. Tank warfare in the Guard is its own form of terror. The crew cannot see the battlefield the way infantry can. They rely on the commander's observations, the gunner's targeting systems, and the information that the infantry Vox relays from the ground. A tank that loses its infantry support is a tank that is vulnerable to close assault, because a lone tank cannot defend its flanks and its rear against enemies who approach from blind spots. And an orc with a crack grenade or a Tyranid with bioacid can destroy a Leman Russ from close range far more easily than from a distance. The worst moment for a tank crew is the penetrating hit, the impact that breaches the hull and sends fragments of metal and superheated gas into the crew compartment. The crew that survives a penetrating hit is a crew that has been trained to react instantly, seal the breach, fight the fire, maintain the tank's combat effectiveness while one or more of the crew is wounded or dead. The crew that does not survive a penetrating hit is a crew that has been killed by the spalling, the secondary fragmentation that the impact produces inside the hull, shrapnel from their own armor cutting through them with lethal effect. The Baneblade is the Guard's super heavy tank, a massive weapons platform that dwarfs the Leman Russ and carries enough firepower to level a city block. The Baneblade is the Guard's equivalent of a Space Marine, a force of such overwhelming power that its mere presence on the battlefield changes the tactical equation, forcing the enemy to deal with the super heavy before anything else can be accomplished. The Guard's artillery arm is, in many ways, its most effective weapon system, and its most morally complex one. Artillery kills without seeing its victims. The crews who load the shells, aim the tubes, and pull the firing mechanisms are often kilometers from the targets they are destroying, and the destruction they produce is invisible to them, reduced to coordinates on a map and the distant, muffled sound of detonations that they feel through the ground more than they hear through the air. This distance is both the artillery's strength and its psychological shield. A guardsman in a trench who bayonets an orc is performing an act of violence that is immediate, personal, and psychologically costly. An artilleryman who fires a basilisk round into a grid square that they cannot see is performing an act of violence that is abstract, impersonal, and psychologically manageable. The enemy is not a person. The enemy is a coordinate, and the coordinate does not scream when the shell lands. But the artillery's effectiveness is undeniable. A well-coordinated artillery barrage can break an enemy assault before it reaches the trench line, can reduce a fortified position to rubble without risking infantry lives, can cover a withdrawal or support an advance with a blanket of high explosive fire that suppresses the enemy's ability to respond. The artillery is the Guard's equalizer, the weapon system that compensates for the infantry's disadvantages in individual combat by delivering firepower at a scale that individual combat cannot match. The Earthshaker cannon, the Basilisk's primary weapon, fires a massive high explosive shell at ranges exceeding 15 kilometers, and the shell's impact produces a blast radius that is sufficient to destroy a bunker or eliminate an infantry platoon. A battery of basilisks, firing in coordinated salvos, can saturate an area the size of a hab block with high explosive ordnance in seconds. And the area after the bombardment is a moonscape of craters, rubble, and the broken remains of whatever was occupying the space before the shells arrived. The Basilisk is the Guard's artillery, a self-propelled gun that fires high explosive shells at ranges that exceed the effective range of most direct fire weapons. Artillery is the Guard's greatest advantage over most of its enemies, the ability to deliver devastating firepower at ranges where the enemy cannot respond. And the Basilisk is the tool that makes this advantage real. The Sentinel is the Guard's scout walker, a light bipedal vehicle that patrols the flanks and the forward positions, providing reconnaissance and light fire support. The Sentinel is fast, maneuverable, and vulnerable, a combination that makes it perfectly suited to the Guard's philosophy of accepting losses in exchange for information. A Sentinel pilot who survives more than a few engagements is a pilot who has learned to use their vehicle's speed to compensate for its lack of armor. And the best Sentinel pilots are among the Guard's most skilled and most expendable soldiers. The Valkyrie is the Guard's aerial transport, a turbofan-powered aircraft that carries a squad of soldiers into the combat zone and provides air support during the insertion. Valkyrie operations are dangerous, the aircraft vulnerable to ground fire during the approach and the landing. And the soldiers who ride in the Valkyrie's hold experience a particular form of terror that ground-based soldiers are spared. The terror of being suspended above the battlefield in a metal box, unable to fight, unable to take cover, entirely dependent on the pilot's skill and the Emperor's protection to survive the journey from the staging area to the landing zone. The Chimera is the Guard's armored transport, the vehicle that carries infantry squads to the front line and provides them with mobile fire support during the assault. The Chimera is not glamorous. It is not powerful. It is the kind of vehicle that no one notices until it is not there, and then its absence is felt immediately, because without the Chimera, the infantry has to walk to the battlefield, and walking to the battlefield in a war zone means dying before you arrive. The Guard fights on every front simultaneously, while the Space Marines deploy to the most critical engagements. The Guard holds every other line. While the Sororitas defend the shrines and the holy sites, the Guard defends everything else. While the Mechanicus guards its forge worlds and the Navy guards the void, the Guard guards the ground, the mud, the rubble, the trenches, the fortifications, the hab blocks, the manufactorum districts, the agri fields, and every other piece of Imperial territory that an enemy might want to take. The fighting is various and relentless. On one front, a Guard regiment is defending a hive city against an Orc war, fighting room by room through the hab blocks, using the narrow corridors and the vertical structure of the hive to negate the Orc's size advantage. On another, a different regiment is holding a trench line against a Tyranid swarm, firing into the endless wave of organisms, replacing fallen soldiers with fresh ones from the reserves, maintaining the rate of fire that the defense requires. On a third, a regiment is advancing across open ground toward a chaos-held fortification, under artillery fire, under las fire, under the constant, grinding pressure of an enemy that does not retreat and does not negotiate. Each of these fights is happening simultaneously. Each involves thousands or millions of soldiers. Each produces casualties at rates that would be considered catastrophic in any other military context. And each is documented by the Departamento Munitorum in the same dry, bureaucratic language that the Administratum uses for everything: forces committed, objectives assigned, casualties sustained, results achieved. The results are usually expressed in one of three categories: victory, defeat, ongoing. Ongoing is the most common. The Guard fights battles that the wider Imperium never hears about. Battles that involve millions of soldiers and last for years. Battles that consume entire regiments and produce casualties that, if they were reported accurately, would shake the faith of every civilian in the Imperium. The Guard fights these battles quietly, anonymously, without the glory that the Space Marines receive, without the reverence that the Sororitas command, without the fear that the Inquisition inspires. The Guard's history is full of moments that would be celebrated as legendary if they had been performed by Space Marines, but that because they were performed by ordinary humans. Receive only the quiet notation of an Administratum after action report. The defense of Hellsreach during the Third War for Armageddon saw a company of Steel Legion soldiers hold a bridge against an Orc assault for 72 hours without reinforcement, without resupply, without any of the support that the Departamento Munitorum's operational plans assumed they would have. The company commander, a lieutenant whose name the law does not record, organized the defense using the vehicles, the rubble, and the bodies of the fallen as barricade material, rotating his soldiers through the firing positions to prevent exhaustion, and maintaining discipline through personal example rather than through the threat of execution. The company held. When reinforcements finally arrived, the bridge was intact, the Orc advance had been stalled, and the company had been reduced to 17 soldiers, out of the original 120. The 17 survivors were given a unit citation, their names recorded in the regimental history, and then deployed to the next engagement. Because the Guard does not offer convalescent leave and the fighting was not over. The lore is full of these moments. The private who picked up a fallen sergeant's voxcaster and called in the artillery strike that saved his platoon. The tank driver who drove her damaged Lehman Russ into the path of an orc stomper, blocking its advance long enough for the infantry to withdraw. The medicae who stayed with the wounded when the evacuation order came, choosing to die with the soldiers she could not save rather than leaving them alone in their final moments. The chaplain who stood on the parapet of a trench and led his company in a hymn while the enemy shelled their position, his voice carrying over the explosions, giving the soldiers something to hold on to when the ground itself was trying to throw them off. None of these people were space marines. None of them had superhuman abilities. None of them had centuries of training or suits of power armor or bolt weapons or any of the advantages that the Imperium's elite warriors enjoy. They had lasguns and flak armor and the courage that comes from being human, from being mortal, from knowing that this is it. This is all there is, this body, this life, this moment, and choosing to spend it in service to something larger than yourself. The Guard does not produce heroes in the way that the Space Marines produce heroes. The Guard produces something different. Ordinary people who in the moment of truth turn out to be extraordinary. Not because they were built that way. Because they chose that way. Because the situation demanded it and they answered the demand. And the answering cost them everything. And they paid the cost. And a line held. On Tanith, before the planet's destruction, a single platoon of newly founded Tanith soldiers held a supply depot against a chaos raiding force for 6 hours, buying time for the civilian evacuation that would save thousands of non-combatants. The platoon was destroyed. Every soldier was killed. The civilians they protected survived. The Tanith, who later learned of this action, honored the dead with a moment of silence that lasted exactly 60 heartbeats, one for each member of the platoon, and then returned to their duties, because the mourning was over and the war was not. These moments are the Guard's treasure, not the victories, which are celebrated by the ecclesiarchy and the propaganda machines and the institutional memory of the Imperium. The moments, the individual acts of courage, of sacrifice, of the desperate, magnificent stubbornness that allows an ordinary human being to stand against the extraordinary and refuse to yield. The Guard fights and dies and is replaced, and the galaxy moves on, and no one remembers the names of the soldiers who held the line. The Third War for Armageddon is a study in what the Guard can achieve when its full resources are committed. The Orc warboss Gazkul Thraka returned to Armageddon with a force of millions, and the Imperium responded with a deployment that was staggering even by the Guard's standards. Dozens of regiments, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, supported by Space Marine chapters and Titan legions and the full might of the Imperium's war machine. The fighting was brutal, prolonged, and devastating to both sides, and the Guard bore the brunt of it, as the Guard always does, because the Guard is the force that holds the line while the Space Marines execute the decisive strikes. The battles for Armageddon's hive cities were among the most brutal urban engagements in Imperial military history. The orcs did not assault the hives the way a conventional military force would, with reconnaissance and preparation and the measured application of force. The orcs simply attacked, slamming into the hive's outer walls with a mass of bodies and vehicles and improvised siege equipment that overwhelmed the outer defenses through sheer, brutal pressure. The sound of a hive city under siege is something that survivors describe for the rest of their lives. The deep structural groaning of a hab block taking fire. The walls absorbing impacts that were designed for the open battlefield. The entire building flexing and shuddering like a living thing in pain. The sharp crack of lasgun fire echoing through corridors that amplify and distort the sound until it becomes a continuous, disorienting wall of noise that makes verbal communication impossible and vox communication unreliable. The guttural, belly-deep bellowing of the orcs, a sound that the human nervous system interprets as a physical threat, a sound that triggers the fight or flight response in every soldier who hears it, and that the soldiers must override, consciously, deliberately, with every fiber of their trained discipline. The smell is worse than the sound. A hive city under siege smells of smoke, of chemical propellant, of blood, of the industrial lubricants that leak from damaged machinery, of the sewage systems that rupture when the infrastructure takes a direct hit, and, underneath all of it, of the particular unforgettable smell of human bodies under extreme stress. The sweat and the fear and the adrenaline combining into an olfactory signature that every veteran recognizes, and that every new recruit learns to associate with the moments before the fighting gets close. The fighting in the hive's interior was close quarters, room to room, floor to floor. The guardsmen fought in corridors that were too narrow for tanks, using lasguns and grenades, and when the ammunition ran out, bayonets and fists and whatever pieces of rubble came to hand. The orcs were larger, stronger and more resilient than the human soldiers they faced. But the hive's interior, with its narrow passages and its vertical structure and its labyrinthine layout, negated the orcs' advantages and played to the guards' strengths, discipline, coordination, and the ability to hold a position under conditions that would make an undisciplined force break. The defense of Hades' hive is the defining battle of the Second War for Armageddon. The orcs breached the outer walls and poured into the hive's lower levels, and the defenders fell back, fighting retreat after fighting retreat, trading ground for time, bleeding the orcs at every intersection, every stairwell, every choke point. The retreats were not panicked, they were calculated, each one planned by officers who understood that the hive's vertical structure meant that every level conceded could be turned into a killing ground for the level above. Yarrick was at the center of it. The old commissar, already a legend from the First War for Armageddon, fought alongside the soldiers he commanded, his power claw and his storm bolter carving through the orcs who reached the upper levels, his presence a rallying point for the defenders who were exhausted, terrified, and running low on everything except determination. The guard held. They held at Hades' hive. They held at Acheron. They held at Infernus. They held against odds that should have been overwhelming, against an enemy that outnumbered them, outmassed them, and outfought them in close combat. And they held because that is what the Guard does. The Guard holds. The Guard has always held. The Guard will always hold, because the alternative is to let the line break, and if the line breaks, everything behind it dies. The Imperial Navy is the Guard's unseen partner, the force that delivers the soldiers to the battlefield, and that controls the space above the battlefield, while the Guard fights on the ground below. The relationship between the Guard and the Navy is defined by the Horus Heresy's aftermath, the Imperial Army. The original combined force that included both ground troops and naval vessels was divided into separate institutions to prevent any single commander from controlling both the soldiers and the ships, a precaution that reflected the Imperium's justified paranoia about military power being concentrated in too few hands. The division creates coordination problems. The Guard's generals and the Navy's admirals communicate through liaison officers, formal channels, and the kind of bureaucratic process that adds hours or days to decisions that should take minutes. On the battlefield, this delay can be lethal. A Guard regiment that needs orbital fire support submits a request through its divisional headquarters, which processes the request and forwards it to the naval liaison, who communicates it to the Fleet Command, which evaluates the request and issues the authorization, which travels back down the chain to the ship that will fire the weapons. The process from request to impact can take hours, hours in which the regiment is dying. The best Guard-Navy partnerships are the ones that bypass the bureaucracy. The commanders who have worked together long enough to develop informal communication channels that allow them to coordinate in real time. These partnerships are unofficial, technically in violation of the protocols that govern inter-service communication, and militarily invaluable. The Navy also provides the Guard's strategic mobility, the ships that carry millions of soldiers across the vast distances between war zones. A Guard regiment's deployment begins with the boarding of a troop transport, a vessel that is designed to carry large numbers of soldiers through the warp to their destination. The journey takes weeks or months, during which the soldiers are confined to the ship's troop decks, cramped, uncomfortable spaces that are designed for capacity rather than comfort. The warp transit is the Guardsman's introduction to the true nature of the galaxy. Many Guardsmen have never left their homeworld before their deployment. Many have never seen a starship. Many do not understand the warp, or the Geller field, or the navigators, or any of the technologies that make interstellar travel possible. They are told to stay on the troop decks. They are told not to look out the viewports, if the troop decks have viewports. They are told to pray, because prayer is the only defense a Guardsman has against the things that exist in the dimension that their ship is traveling through. The troop decks are communities, temporary but intense, formed by the shared experience of confinement and the shared anticipation of combat. The soldiers organize themselves by squad, by platoon, by the social groupings that military life naturally produces, and the weeks or months of transit time become a period of bonding, training, and the psychological preparation that the deployment ahead demands. The officers use the transit time for training, running drills in the ship's cargo bays, conducting tactical briefings in the briefing rooms, and, when the ship's layout permits, staging live fire exercises in the firing ranges that some troop transports maintain for this purpose. The training is vital, because a regiment that arrives at its deployment zone without having trained together is a regiment that will take casualties from coordination failures that training would have prevented. The entertainments are limited. Some ships have mess halls where the soldiers can gather, eat, and socialize. Some have chapels where the regimental chaplain conducts services. Some have recreational facilities, though these are typically Spartan, consisting of a cleared space where the soldiers can exercise, and a few decks of cards that have been shuffled so many times that the markings are barely visible. The rumour mill runs constantly. The soldiers know, or think they know, where they are going. They know, or think they know, what they will face when they arrive. The rumours are usually wrong, because the soldiers' information comes from the same grapevine that processes every piece of data through layers of distortion and speculation. But the rumours provide a narrative, a story that the soldiers can tell themselves about their future, and the story, however inaccurate, gives them something to prepare for. The worst part of the transit is the landing. The troop transport enters orbit around the target world, and the soldiers, who have been confined to the ship's interior for weeks, are loaded into dropships and shuttles and sent to the surface. The transition from the relative safety of the troop transport to the absolute danger of the landing zone is the most psychologically intense moment of the deployment. The moment when the abstract concept of combat becomes the concrete reality of enemy fire, and the soldiers' training, their faith, their conditioning, and whatever reserves of courage they possess are tested for the first time. The nightmares during warp transit are universal. Every guardsman experiences them. The chaplains attribute them to the Emperor testing the faithful. The soldiers attribute them to the ship's food. The truth, which neither the chaplains nor the soldiers are equipped to understand, is that the warp is bleeding through the Geller Field's protection, seeping into the sleeping minds of the soldiers like water through cracks in a dam. And the nightmares are not dreams but glimpses, brief, fragmented perceptions of the true nature of the immaterium that the human mind processes as horror because horror is the closest emotional category available. The human cost of the Guard's operations is measured in numbers so large that they become abstract. 1 million casualties in a single campaign is not unusual. 10 million is notable but not exceptional. 100 million, over the course of a prolonged engagement like the Siege of Rax or the Wars for Armageddon, is documented and filed and archived and forgotten. Because the Administratum processes casualties the way it processes everything else, as data. But the casualties are not data. They are people. They are the conscript from the agri-world who learned to fire a lasgun 3 weeks ago, and who died in a trench on a planet whose name they never learned. They are the Cadian veteran who survived 15 years of frontline combat, and who was killed by a stray round on a routine patrol. They are the Death Corps soldier who charged into the enemy's fire with the deliberate intention of dying, and who achieved their goal with the quiet satisfaction of a debt repaid. They are the Katachan who survived the deadliest planet in the galaxy, and was killed by a weapon that they never saw, on a world that was nothing like home. Each casualty is a person. Each person had a name, even if the Departamento Munitorum never recorded it. Each person had a story, even if no one will ever tell it. Each person fought and feared and hoped and died, and the dying was the end of a universe. Because every consciousness is a universe, and when a consciousness ends, a universe ends with it, and the galaxy is diminished by one. And the galaxy does not notice, because the galaxy has 1 trillion universes to spare. The relationship between the Guard and the Space Marines is complicated and rarely discussed honestly by either party. The Space Marines are demigods. The Guard knows this. Every guardsman who has fought alongside Space Marines has experienced the mixture of awe, relief, terror, and inadequacy that the presence of the Adeptus Astartes produces in mortal soldiers. The Space Marines are everything the Guardsman is not. Tall, armored, fast, strong, fearless, lethal, and apparently immortal. A Space Marine can do in seconds what a platoon of Guardsmen cannot do in hours. A squad of Space Marines can turn a battle that a regiment of Guard cannot win. This is inspiring. It is also demoralizing. And the demoralization is not the kind that the Commissar can fix with a bullet. The Space Marines, for their part, view the Guard with a range of attitudes that reflects the diverse cultures of the Astartes chapters. The Ultramarines, who value order and efficiency, regard the Guard as a necessary component of the Imperium's military structure. Soldiers who serve a vital function, and who deserve the respect that competent service earns. The Space Wolves view the Guard with a rough affection, treating the human soldiers as courageous underdogs, whose willingness to fight against impossible odds resonates with the Wolves' own warrior culture. Other chapters are less generous. The Iron Hands regard the Guard as a fragile, unreliable component in the Imperium's war machine. Too slow, too weak, too prone to the organic failures that the Iron Hands have spent millennia trying to eliminate through augmentation. The Marines Malevolent, one of the most callous chapters in the Imperium, have repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice Guard formations to achieve their objectives, treating the human soldiers as expendable screens rather than as allies. The Guard soldiers who fight alongside Space Marines carry the memory of the experience for the rest of their lives, which, given the Guard's casualty rates, may not be very long. The memory is complex. Pride at having served alongside the Emperor's finest, relief at having survived an engagement that the Space Marines' presence made winnable, and a quiet, persistent awareness that the Space Marines regarded them, if they regarded them at all, as useful obstacles between the real warriors and the enemy. There are exceptions. There are always exceptions. The Salamanders, the Space Marine chapter that values human life above all others, treat the Guard with a respect and a warmth that the soldiers never forget. A Guardsman who has fought alongside the Salamanders tells the story for the rest of their life, because the Salamanders' treatment of mortal soldiers, the way they shield the Guard from fire, the way they acknowledge the Guard's contributions, the way they mourn the Guard's dead, is so unusual, so unexpected, so completely at odds with the typical Space Marine Guard dynamic that it becomes a treasured memory. The Ultramarines Codex Astartes, the manual that governs the organization and deployment of most Space Marine chapters, includes sections on coordination with Guard forces. And these sections, while clinical in their language, reflect a recognition that the Guard's contribution to the Imperium's military operations is essential, and that the Space Marines' effectiveness depends, in part, on the Guard's ability to hold the ground that the Space Marines do not have the numbers to hold. But recognition in a manual is not the same as respect on the battlefield. And respect on the battlefield, the mutual acknowledgement between warriors that they are engaged in a shared enterprise and that each party's contribution matters, is the thing that the Guard craves, and that the Space Marines, with rare exceptions, do not provide, if they regarded them at all as insects scurrying around the feet of gods. Because the Space Marine's effectiveness highlights the Guardsman's limitations. The ease with which a Space Marine kills the enemy highlights the difficulty the Guardsman faces in doing the same thing. The Space Marine's armor which shrugs off hits that would kill a Guardsman instantly. highlights the inadequacy of flak armour. The Space Marine's bolt weapon, which kills with a single shot what the lasgun cannot kill with a dozen, highlights the weakness of the Guardsman's primary armament. The Guardsman watches the Space Marine fight and thinks, "We are doing the same job." But they are equipped for the job and we are not. We are sent to fight the same enemies with weapons that are inadequate and armor that is insufficient and training that is incomplete. We die in thousands to accomplish what they accomplish in tens. The thought is never spoken. The commissar would not approve. The ecclesiarchy would not approve. The Guard's institutional culture, which depends on the soldier's willingness to fight regardless of the odds, cannot afford to acknowledge the fundamental unfairness of the Guardsman's situation. The Guardsman fights not because the fight is fair, but because the fight is necessary. And the necessity overrides the fairness, and the Guardsman accepts this, because the Guardsman has no choice. This acceptance is the Guard's greatest quality. The willingness to fight knowing that the fight is unfair. The willingness to die knowing that the death will not be remembered. The willingness to stand in line with a lasgun and flak armor and face an enemy that outclasses you in every measurable dimension, and to pull the trigger anyway because the line must be held and you are the one holding it. The Guard also employs abhumans, the genetically divergent human subspecies that the Imperium tolerates, grudgingly, as useful tools. Ogryns are the most visible abhumans in the Guard. Massive, powerful, and profoundly simple-minded creatures whose stupidity is matched only by their loyalty and their physical strength. An Ogryn stands 3 meters tall, weighs as much as a small vehicle, and can tear a door off its hinges with one hand. In combat, Ogryns are devastatingly effective at close range, their massive ripper guns and their even more massive fists producing damage that is disproportionate to their intelligence, which is considerable in its deficiency. The Ogryn's loyalty to the Emperor is absolute, touching and not fully understood. Ogryns worship the Emperor with a childlike devotion that the ecclesiarchy finds simultaneously useful and embarrassing. And the Ogryn's simple faith, uncomplicated by the theological subtleties that trouble more intelligent believers, is one of the most genuine expressions of religious devotion in the entire Imperium. An Ogryn will follow the Emperor's orders, as interpreted by the nearest officer, with a blind, trusting obedience that a commissar can only dream of producing in more intelligent soldiers. Bonehead Ogryns have received limited cybernetic enhancement to their cognitive function, raising their intelligence just enough to follow slightly more complex orders and to serve as squad leaders for Ogryn formations. The Bonehead is still not, by any conventional standard, intelligent, but a Bonehead who can count to 10 and understand the concepts of left and right is, by Ogryn standards, a tactical genius. Ratlings are the Guard's snipers, small rotund abhumans whose excellent eyesight and steady hands make them natural marksmen. Ratlings are also notorious thieves, their nimble fingers and their instinctive aversion to military discipline, making them the bane of the commissariat and the delight of the soldiers, who benefit from the supplementary rations that the Ratlings invariably acquire through channels that the Departamento Munitorum does not officially recognize. There are penal legions, soldiers who have committed crimes that warrant more than imprisonment but less than execution, who are given a lasgun, a bomb collar, and a position on the front line. They are the expendable among the expendable, the disposable among the disposable, and their life expectancy is measured in minutes rather than hours. Penal legionnaires are used as screening forces, as mine clearers, as decoys, as ablative casualties whose deaths serve the tactical purpose of revealing enemy positions. Their officers, typically commissars, maintain discipline through the bomb collars, explosive devices that can be detonated remotely if the legionnaire attempts to flee. Some penal legionnaires survive. Some fight with such skill and desperation that they earn their freedom, their sentences commuted, their bomb collars removed. These survivors are rare, and they carry the experience of the penal legion with them for the rest of their service, which tends to be solitary, watchful, and characterized by the particular kind of paranoia that comes from having served in a unit where your commanding officer had a remote control device that could blow your head off. The Tempestus Scions are the Guard's elite, the closest thing that the Astra Militarum has to a special forces formation. The Scions are drawn from the Schola Progenium, the same institution that produces commissars and sisters of battle, and they receive training that is more rigorous, more comprehensive, and more physically demanding than anything the regular guard provides. Scions are equipped with hotshot lasguns, weapons that draw more power from their cells and produce a more potent beam than the standard lasgun, at the cost of reduced battery life and increased heat generation. They wear carapace armour, which is significantly more protective than the flak armour that regular guardsmen wear, though still insufficient against the heaviest weapons that the galaxy produces. They operate in small, independent squads, deploying by grav shoot or Valkyrie insertion to objectives that are too dangerous or too delicate for regular infantry. The Scions are the Guard's scalpel. They perform the surgical strikes that the regular Guard cannot, the assassination missions, the sabotage operations, the behind-the-lines reconnaissance that provides the intelligence on which the larger campaign depends. They are highly trained, highly motivated, and highly expendable, because the missions they undertake have casualty rates that exceed even the Guard's already grim standards. A Scion knows that their mission is likely to be their last. The training has prepared them for this. The faith has prepared them for this. The years at the Schola Progenium, the indoctrination, the conditioning, the systematic removal of doubt and fear, and the replacement of these natural human responses with duty and discipline, and the absolute conviction that the Emperor's will is worth dying for, has prepared them for this. They deploy, they fight, they complete the mission, or they die trying, and their bodies, if they can be recovered, are returned to the Schola Progenium for the funeral rites that the institution provides for its graduates, which are brief, formal, and attended by the next generation of orphans who are being trained to take their place. Some fight with such skill and desperation that they earn their freedom, their sentences commuted, their bomb collars removed. These survivors are rare, hardened beyond the ordinary, carrying the knowledge that their second chance at life was purchased with the blood of the comrades who did not survive. The Tanith first and only deserve mention, because their story, told in Dan Abnett's Gaunt's Ghosts novels, is the Guard's definitive narrative in the lore. The Tanith were raised from a forest world that was destroyed by chaos during their founding, leaving the regiment without a homeworld. A people of ghosts fighting for a world that no longer existed. Their commander, Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt, led them through campaigns that tested their endurance, their loyalty, and their identity, and the novels that document their service are the most complete portrait of Guard life that the lore has produced. The Tanith are scouts, stealth specialists, soldiers who move through the battlefield like shadows, using the woodcraft that their destroyed homeworld taught them to operate behind enemy lines, to gather intelligence, to perform the kind of surgical operations that the Guard, with its emphasis on mass formations and attritional warfare, does not usually attempt. They are the Guard's special forces, operating in a role that is typically reserved for Space Marine scouts, and they perform that role with a competence that has earned them respect from even the Astartes. Colonel Commissar Gaunt himself is a fascinating study in the contradictions of the Guard's officer class. A commissar by training, empowered to execute any soldier who falters, Gaunt is also a commander, responsible for the welfare and the effectiveness of the soldiers he leads. These two roles, the enforcer and the leader, the punisher and the protector, are in constant tension, and the novels that document Gaunt's career explore that tension with a nuance that the wider lore does not always achieve. Gaunt cares about his soldiers. This is unusual for a commissar. The Scholar Progenium's training emphasizes the mission over the individual, the Emperor's will over the soldier's welfare, the cold calculus of military necessity over the warm, messy, inconvenient business of caring about the people who carry out the mission. Gaunt's ability to balance these competing demands, to enforce discipline without becoming a tyrant, to lead without becoming soft, to care about his soldiers without allowing that caring to compromise the mission, is what makes him the Guard's most compelling officer. The Ghosts fight in campaigns that test every dimension of their identity. They fight in hive cities and on open plains and in forests and in the ruins of civilizations that fell to chaos millennia ago. They fight enemies that range from conventional military forces to Chaos Space Marines to daemons that the uplifting primer does not mention, and that the ecclesiarchy would prefer the soldiers did not know about. And through each campaign, the question that drives the narrative is not whether they will win, because the Guard does not always win, but whether they will survive as a regiment, as a community, as a family of soldiers who have nothing left except each other. Their story is the story of the Guard writ small. The story of ordinary people with ordinary weapons and ordinary fears, doing extraordinary things because the situation demands it, and because someone has to. The Tanith did not choose to be homeless. They did not choose to fight. They did not choose the wars they were sent to or the enemies they faced. They chose to fight well and to fight for each other. And that choice, repeated 1,000 times across 1,000 battlefields, is what separates the Guard from the statistics that describe it. Let us talk about what it means to be ordinary in an extraordinary universe. The Guardsman is ordinary. This is not an insult. This is the point. The Guardsman is an ordinary human being, with ordinary human limitations, ordinary human fears, ordinary human courage. The Guardsman does not have superhuman strength. The Guardsman does not have centuries of combat training. The Guardsman does not have a suit of power armour that can shrug off direct hits from anti-vehicle weapons. The Guardsman has a lasgun, a set of flak armour, and whatever courage they can muster from the bottom of a terrified, fragile, mortal soul. And they fight. They fight the things that the galaxy produces, the orcs and the Tyranids and the Chaos Marines and the Necrons and the Dark Eldar and the Daemon Princes and the Titan-sized bioconstructs and the warp-spawn nightmares that would make a Space Marine pause and that make a Guardsman want to drop their weapon and run screaming into the darkness. They do not run. Most of them. Most of the time, they stand And they fire, and they hold, and they die, and they are replaced, and the replacements stand and fire and hold and die, and the cycle continues, and the line does not break, and the Imperium endures. This is the Guard's contribution to the Imperium. Not brilliance, not superhuman prowess, not the decisive, battle-turning strike that the Space Marines provide. The Guard's contribution is endurance, the willingness to absorb casualties that no other military force could sustain, the willingness to hold ground that no other military force would consider defensible, the willingness to fight wars that last for decades, wars that consume millions, wars that grind both sides down to nothing, and to keep fighting, to keep sending soldiers, to keep holding the line, because the alternative is worse. Always the alternative is worse. And the Guard knows this because the Guard has seen the alternative. The Guard has seen the worlds that fell, the planets that the line did not hold, the civilizations that the enemy consumed, because there were not enough soldiers, not enough lasguns, not enough flak armor, not enough stubborn, terrified, magnificent humans standing in the gap. The Guard has seen Tyranid consumed worlds, stripped to bare rock, their entire biosphere dissolved into nutrient slurry. The Guard has seen orc-infested worlds, overrun by greenskins who have turned the planet's cities into scrap heaps and its population into slaves. The Guard has seen chaos, corrupted worlds, twisted by warp energy into nightmares that the soldiers who reclaim them will carry in their memories for the rest of their lives. The Guard has seen these things, and the seeing has reinforced the conviction that the line must be held, that the alternative to holding the line is the extinction of everything that the Guard is fighting to protect, and that the cost of holding the line, however enormous, is less than the cost of letting it fall. This is the grim mathematics of the 41st millennium. The cost of survival is measured in human lives. The currency is blood. The exchange rate is catastrophically unfavorable. And the Guard, which processes this equation every day on every front against every enemy, has accepted the terms, because the only alternative to accepting the terms is accepting the end of everything. Always the alternative is worse. And the Guardsmen know this. They know that the Imperium is not kind. They know that the Emperor's protection is not a guarantee. They know that their officers are often incompetent. Their equipment is often inadequate. Their training is often insufficient, and their chances of surviving long enough to see their homeworld again are approximately zero. They fight anyway. They fight because they are human, because humans endure, because somewhere in the deepest part of the human soul there is a quality that the Chaos Gods cannot corrupt, that the Tyranids cannot consume, that the Necrons cannot strip away atom by atom, a quality that has no name, that defies analysis, that exists independently of hope or faith or reason. The Guard's contribution to the Imperium's survival is not dramatic. It is not heroic in the way that the Space Marines' contributions are heroic, the decisive strike, the turning point, the moment when the superhuman warriors descend from the heavens and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The Guard's contribution is the years of holding the line before the Space Marines arrive. The Guard's contribution is the millions of casualties absorbed while the Space Marines execute their surgical strike. The Guard's contribution is the slow, grinding, attritional warfare that wears the enemy down to the point where the Space Marines' decisive action can succeed. This contribution is essential. Without the Guard, the Space Marines' decisive strikes would have no foundation. Without the Guard holding the flanks, the Space Marines' assaults would be counterattacked. Without the Guard absorbing the enemy's strength, the Space Marines' precision would be wasted against an enemy that was too powerful to be surgically removed. The Guard is the body. The Space Marines are the blade. The body absorbs the blows that the blade cannot parry. The body endures the pain that the blade does not feel. The body bleeds so that the blade can cut. And the body is never thanked because the audience remembers the killing blow and forgets the bruises that made the killing blow possible. This is the Guard's lot. This has always been the Guard's lot, and the Guard accepts it, not with joy, not with resentment, but with the resigned pragmatism of soldiers who have learned that fairness is a luxury that the 41st millennium does not provide. Stubbornness, perhaps, or defiance, or the simple, irrational refusal to die quietly when the universe is doing its best to kill you loudly. The Guardsman holds their lasgun. The Guardsman checks their flak armour. The Guardsman watches the horizon, where the shapes are moving, where the enemy is coming, where the dying is about to begin. The psychology of the Guardsman is the psychology of a person who has accepted, consciously or unconsciously, that their life is no longer their own. The moment the conscript puts on the uniform and picks up the lasgun, they become property of the Imperium, a resource to be deployed and expended as the Departamento Militarum sees fit. The Guardsman's body belongs to the Emperor. The Guardsman's labor belongs to the regiment. The Guardsman's death belongs to the cause. This loss of autonomy produces a range of psychological responses. Some Guardsmen embrace it, finding in the regiment a sense of purpose and belonging that their previous lives did not provide. The camaraderie of the squad, the shared experience of danger, the bonds that form between soldiers who depend on each other for survival, provides a social structure that is, for many Guardsmen, more meaningful than anything they had before they were conscripted. Others retreat into the rituals of faith. The ecclesiarchy's influence on the Guard is pervasive, the constant drumbeat of prayer, hymn, and catechism providing a soundtrack to military life that fills the silences between engagements and gives the Guardsmen a narrative in which their suffering has meaning. The Emperor protects. The Emperor tests. The Emperor rewards the faithful with eternal life in his presence after death. These assertions, whether true or not, provide a psychological anchor that keeps the Guardsmen functional in situations that would otherwise overwhelm their capacity for coping. The regimental chaplains, the priests attached to each Guard formation, serve a function that is part spiritual counselor and part morale officer. They lead the prayers before battle. They administer the last rites to the dying. They circulate among the soldiers during the quiet moments, listening to their fears, reinforcing their faith, reminding them that their suffering serves a purpose that transcends their individual existence. The chaplain's job is to maintain the Guardsman's psychological viability, to keep the human machinery functioning at a level that allows it to hold a lasgun and pull the trigger. And the chaplain does this job with the same methodical attention that the engine seer applies to maintaining the regiment's vehicles. Still others cope through the gallows humour that is the Guard's most distinctive cultural product. Guard humour is dark, profane, and relentlessly self-deprecating, a running commentary on the absurdity of the Guardsman's situation that acknowledges the hopelessness without surrendering to it. The jokes are about death, about fear, about the inadequacy of the equipment, about the incompetence of the officers, about the Departamento Militarum's bureaucratic failures, about everything that makes the guardsman's life miserable, and that the guardsman is powerless to change. The humor binds the squad together in ways that formal military structure cannot. The Departamento Munitorum can assign soldiers to a squad. It cannot make them care about each other. The humor does that. The shared laughter, the inside jokes, the nicknames that soldiers give each other and that the commissar pretends not to hear, creates the bonds that transform a group of strangers into a family. A dysfunctional family, certainly. A family that argues and fights and competes and occasionally comes to blows, but a family nonetheless, united by the shared experience of the absurdity and the horror and the strange, fierce pride that comes from surviving together in conditions that should have killed them all. The humor is also the guard's way of processing the incomprehensible. A guardsman who has seen a daemon manifest in the ruins of a hab block cannot tell anyone about it, because the commissariat prohibits discussion of chaos phenomena. But the guardsman can make a joke about unusual weather, and the other soldiers who were there will laugh, and the laughter will contain the fear and the horror and the memory of the thing they saw, and the containing will make the memory manageable, and the manageability will allow the guardsman to function, and the functioning will continue until the next engagement. The humor is not morale, the humor is survival. It is the mechanism by which the human mind processes experiences that are too extreme for conventional emotional responses. The pressure valve that prevents the accumulation of horror and grief and fear from building to a level that shatters the consciousness that contains it. The guardsman whispers a prayer. Not because they believe the emperor will hear it, because the prayer is a ritual, a habit, a small act of normalcy in a situation that is profoundly, cosmically abnormal. The enemy comes. The lasgun fires. The line holds. And somewhere in a Departamento Munitorum office on a world 10,000 light-years away, a clerk adjusts a number on a data slate, a number that represents the guardsman's regiment, and the number goes down by 1, and the clerk does not pause, does not reflect, does not wonder about the person behind the number. The clerk adjusts the next number, and the next, and the next. The opening of the Great Rift changed the Guard's operating environment in ways that the Departamento Munitorum is still struggling to adapt to. The rift divided the galaxy in half, cutting supply lines, disrupting communications, and stranding thousands of Guard regiments on the wrong side of the divide. The regiments on the far side of the rift, in the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy that has been cut off from the Astronomican's light, fight without reinforcement, without resupply, without the knowledge that the wider Imperium knows they exist, or that anyone is coming to help them. These isolated regiments are the Guard at its most heroic and its most tragic. Cut off from everything that sustains a military force, they fight on. They scavenge ammunition from the dead. They repair their equipment with improvised materials. They recruit from the local population, training new soldiers with whatever methods they can manage, producing fighters who are poorly equipped and poorly trained, but who are willing, and willingness, in the absence of everything else, is enough. Some of these isolated regiments have been fighting for years without contact from the Imperium. They do not know whether the Imperium still exists. They do not know whether the Emperor still sits on the Golden Throne. They do not know whether anyone, anywhere, remembers them or cares about their survival. They fight because fighting is what the Guard does, because the habits of duty and discipline that were drilled into them during their training persist even when the institution that drilled them has lost contact. The Primarch Robert Guilliman's return and the Indomitus Crusade have brought relief to some of these isolated forces, the first contact with the wider Imperium in years or decades, and the relief is described in the lore with an emotional weight that reflects the significance of the moment. The isolated regiment sees the Crusade's ships in their sky. The Vox comes alive with Imperial transmissions, reinforcements land, supplies arrive, and the soldiers who have been fighting alone, in the dark, without hope, for years, stand in their trenches and watch the Imperium return and feel something that the nails-driven berserkers and the daemon-worshipping cultists and the soulless Necrons can never feel: relief, hope, the knowledge that they are not alone. The Guard endures. The Guard has always endured. Not through strength, not through power, not through the divine intervention of a God Emperor whose attention is elsewhere, and whose protection is at best inconsistent through numbers, through stubbornness, through the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, not because they are heroes, but because they are there. And someone has to hold the line, and they are the ones holding it. The Guard is the setting's conscience. In a universe of superhuman warriors and cosmic gods and ancient machines and biological nightmares, the Guard is the reminder that the galaxy is inhabited by people. Ordinary people with ordinary limitations, ordinary fears, ordinary hopes, ordinary loves. People who did not ask to be born in the 41st millennium. People who did not choose the enemies they face. People who would, given the option, prefer a universe that did not require them to hold a lasgun and stand in a trench and watch the horizon for signs of things that want to kill them. The Guard is the answer to the question that the Warhammer 40,000 universe implicitly asks: what can ordinary people do in extraordinary circumstances? The answer is, they can hold the line. They cannot defeat the Tyranid single-handedly. They cannot banish daemons. They cannot turn the tide of a battle with a single heroic charge. But they can hold the line. They can stand in their trench with their lasgun and their flak armour and their fear, and they can fire at the enemy, and they can hold their position, and they can hold it again, and they can keep holding it until the reinforcements arrive, or the ammunition runs out, or the enemy breaks through, or the guardsman dies, and if the guardsman dies, the soldier next to them takes their place. And the line holds. This is not dramatic. This is not cinematic. This is not the kind of heroism that makes for exciting stories or inspiring propaganda, or the chapter-length narratives that the Space Marines' victories receive. This is the boring heroism, the quiet heroism, the heroism of showing up and doing the job and not dying, or dying and being replaced by someone else who shows up and does the job and does not die, or dies. The Guard is the Imperium's greatest achievement, and its greatest crime. The achievement is the institution itself, the logistical miracle of maintaining a fighting force of trillions across a galaxy of 1 million worlds. The crime is what the institution does to the people who compose it. The systematic dehumanization of human beings into expendable units of military production. The conversion of persons into personnel. The reduction of lives to statistics. The galaxy does not deserve them. The Imperium does not deserve them. The Emperor, enthroned on terror, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psykers a day, does not deserve the loyalty of the men and women who die in his name, on worlds he will never visit, in wars he will never acknowledge, against enemies he did not warn them about. But they give it anyway. They give their loyalty, their courage, their lives, their deaths, because that is what guardsmen do. That is what they have always done. That is what they will always do. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, and the war is fought by ordinary people, and the ordinary people hold the line. For the Emperor, for the Imperium, for the regiment, for the soldier standing next to you who is just as frightened as you are, who is holding their lasgun with hands that are shaking, who is whispering the same prayer that you are whispering, who will die beside you or survive beside you, and either way you will face it together. That is the Guard. That is the Astra Militarum. That is the hammer of the Emperor. And the hammer holds. Somewhere tonight a guardsman is standing watch. They are standing on the wall of a fortress, on a world whose name they cannot pronounce, watching a sky that is not the sky they grew up under, holding a weapon that is adequate but not excellent, wearing armour that is thin but not non-existent, carrying in their heart a faith that is uncertain but not absent. The stars above are not the stars of home. They are the wrong colour, in the wrong positions, and the guardsman who grew up under a different sky feels the displacement as a physical sensation, a low-level discomfort that comes from being in a place that is fundamentally irreducibly wrong. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong. The sky is wrong. The air smells wrong. The ground feels wrong beneath the guardsman's boots. Everything about this world is wrong, and the wrongness is the background radiation of the guardsman's existence, the constant reminder that they are far from home, that they will never go home, that the home they knew may no longer exist. The enemy is out there. The guardsman can feel them. Not through any psychic gift, not through any superhuman sense, but through the ordinary human intuition that tells you when you are being watched. When the darkness contains something that means you harm, when the silence before the storm is about to break. The guardsman checks their lasgun. The power pack is charged, the bayonet is fixed, the prayers have been said, the letters have been written. The soldier beside them, who is also awake, who is also watching, who is also afraid, nods, a small nod, a nod that says, I am here. You are not alone. Whatever comes, we face it together. The guardsman's war is not the war of legends. It is not the war of the Space Marines where individual heroes change the course of battles. It is not the war of the Primarchs where demigods clash over the fate of civilizations. The guardsman's war is the war of mud and blood and cold rations and broken equipment and the constant, grinding, unglamorous work of holding ground that no one will remember and fighting battles that no one will celebrate. And yet it is the most important war in the galaxy. Because without it, the legends do not happen. Without the Guard holding every other line, the Space Marines cannot concentrate their strength for the decisive blow. Without the Guard absorbing the enemy's numbers, the Primarch's battles would be fought against overwhelming odds. Without the Guard, the Imperium falls. Not dramatically, not heroically. It simply crumbles, one undefended line at a time, one overrun position at a time, one lost world at a time, until there is nothing left to defend and no one left to defend it. This is the Imperial Guard. This is the hammer of the Emperor. This is the answer that 1 trillion ordinary people give to the extraordinary darkness of the far future. We are here. We are not leaving. We will hold the line. For the Emperor. For Cadia. For Katachan. For Krieg and Talan and Valhalla and Mordian and Vostroya and Armageddon and a million other worlds whose names the wider Imperium has never heard and whose soldiers the wider Imperium will never thank. For the soldier beside you. And the hammer holds. Good night.